Okay, so we are at quorum, so we would like to get started. Good morning and welcome everyone to the Assembly Bill 32 Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. My name is Karina Jaj and I'm the lead staff in the Office of Environmental Justice, Tribal Affairs, and Border Relations. I'm excited to be here with you all today. So before we start with our order of business, housekeeping will be covered on Zoom, Spanish interpretation, and a few critical details related to the Sacramento facilities. Zoom details will be provided shortly as a reminder for comment periods. Spanish interpretation will be provided in the Spanish channel in Zoom for the duration of the meeting. And we do have 3 interpreters to support today's meeting, and we will have them introduce themselves shortly. For those in the building, restrooms are outside the door to the left and down the hall by the drinking fountains. In case of an emergency, please exit out the door and to the right down the stairs. For members of the public participating remotely, you will be able to raise your hand in Zoom to speak during the public comment period. When it's your turn, the host will ask you to unmute, and after you push the unmute button, you may begin to speak. We will be switching off between commenters in the room and on Zoom. We intend to give each commenter 3 minutes to speak, and we'll let you know if any changes are required based on the volume of comments. In the event that *6 does not work to unmute, CARB can unmute you. We appreciate you staying on mute until it's your turn to speak to be respectful of everybody's turn. And please remember to state your name and affiliation if applicable so that we know who is speaking, and we'll do our best to do the same in the room for members of the public to know who is talking. And Q&A and chat functions in Zoom are turned off for participants. So now I'd like to introduce our Spanish interpreters, Fabiola, Leticia, and Aldo, who are on the line. Could you please all briefly introduce yourselves? And we'll start with Fabiola.
Hi, good morning. My name is Fabiola Valencia. I am your Spanish interpreter. Buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Fabiola Valencia y soy su intérprete del idioma en español.
Thank you. And then Leticia?
Sure. Hi, good afternoon. This is Leticia Reina, Spanish interpreter, or one of the 3 of us. Hola, buenos días. Buenas tardes a todos. Soy una de las intérpretes el día de hoy. Mi nombre es Leticia Reina y les estaremos ayudando el día de hoy.
Thank you. And then lastly, Aldo?
Yes, hi. Hello, everybody. My name is Aldo Renteria, one of the interpreters as well. Buenos días a todos y soy también uno de los intérpretes el día de hoy. Gracias.
Thank you so much. And then Fabiola, could you please provide the translated information on this slide?
Buenos días a todos, o buenas tardes más bien. Quiero presentarles a ustedes el día de hoy, para los miembros del público que van a participar a distancia. Y si van a participar por teléfono, por medio del Zoom, marcar el número 2 para levantar la mano. Se les informará a los participantes en el teléfono cuando se les quitará el sonido durante la sesión de comentario público. Marque *6 para silenciar o reactivar el sonido. Ustedes pueden ver la mano en la parte de abajo para que ustedes puedan levantar y hablar.
Thank you. So for those who are participating in person, to prevent echoes, we request that you click on the symbol next to the unmute button as seen in number 1. Next, select Leave Computer Audio as seen as number 2. And then also please make sure to stay muted for the full duration of the meeting to just avoid background noise as seen in number 3. And Fabiola, could you please provide the instructions on this slide?
Para aquellos que están participando en persona, para evitar ecos, le pedimos que por favor hagan clic en el símbolo junto al botón del silencio, como se ve en el número 1. A continuación, seleccione dejar el audio del ordenador, como se ve en el número 2. Además, asegurarse de permanecer en silencio durante toda la reunión para evitar el ruido de fondo, como se ve en el número 3.
Thank you. So next, we will provide instructions in English and Spanish, and then we'll enable interpretation features in Zoom. When the interpretation globe appears at the bottom right corner of Zoom as seen in number 1, please choose your preferred language as English or Spanish as seen in number 2. Fabiola, could you please provide these instructions in Spanish?
A continuación, daremos las instrucciones en inglés y español y les vamos a dar acceso a las funciones de interpretación por medio de Zoom. Cuando aparezca el globo de la interpretación en la esquina inferior derecha de Zoom, como se ve en el número 1, por favor, elija su idioma preferido como inglés o español. como se ve en el número 2.
Thank you. And for individuals in the room needing in-person translation services, please raise your hand and a staff person will log you into Zoom or do live translation if needed via the translation headsets. CARB staff will ensure that your headset is on and working prior to speaking. Fabiola, could you please provide these instructions in Spanish?
Para las personas en la sala que necesiten servicios de traducción en persona, por favor levanten la mano y un miembro del personal les conectará a Zoom o hará la traducción en directo si es necesario a través de los auriculares de traducción. El personal de CARB se asegurará que sus auriculares estén encendidos y funcionando antes de hablar.
Thank you. If for any reason you require technical Zoom support in today's meeting, please contact Bobby Roosh, who is in person here in Sacramento, by email as provided on this slide. We will do our best to assist you. Today's meeting is being recorded. CARB staff will post to the EJAC meetings and events website in the coming weeks. This is the same website where you can find all materials for today's meeting as provided on this slide. Fabiola, could you please provide these instructions in Spanish?
Por razón usted necesita apoyo técnico de Zoom en la reunión de hoy, por favor pónganse en contacto con Bobby Roosh, que está en persona aquí en el área de Sacramento, por correo electrónico, como se indica en esta diapositiva. Haremos todo lo posible para poderles ayudar. La reunión de hoy está siendo grabada. El personal de CARB publicará la grabación en el sitio web de reuniones y eventos del EJAC en las próximas semanas. Este es el mismo sitio web donde se puede encontrar todo el material para la reunión de hoy, como se indica en esta diapositiva.
Thank you. And with that, I would like to begin the EJAC member roll call. So I will go ahead and call your name. When I do, please state here or present. And if you could also briefly introduce yourselves as well, that would be great. So just name, affiliation, and pronouns. So first we have Martha Dina Arguello.
Good afternoon, everybody. Marta Dina Arguello with Physicians for Social Responsibility, she, her pronouns.
Thank you. Oh, and then if you could also state if you're virtual or in person.
And I am virtual.
Thank you. And then Juan Flores.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am virtual. I'm located in Kern County. I'm in transit. As soon as I get to my location, I'll be turning my camera on. And I am with the Center on Race, Poverty, and Environment.
Thank you. Catherine Garupa.
Good afternoon, everyone. Catherine Garupa, they and she pronouns with the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition, or CVAC. Just a quick heads up, Martha Dina, your audio is a little bit soft like it was last meeting.
Okay. Well,
Oh, and I'm in person.
Thank you. Kevin Hamilton. John Harriel Jr. Thomas Helm.
Hey everybody, Tom Helm, co-founder of Valley Improvement Projects, he, him, his. I am attending virtually.
Thank you. Matt Holmes. Matt Holmes. Matt, I see you're unmuted, but we can't hear you, unfortunately.
How about now?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay, I'm really sorry. Matt Holmes in Stockton, California. Masculine pronouns, represent the California Environmental Justice Coalition, attending remotely. Sorry about that.
Perfect. Thank you. Kevin Jefferson III. Oh, Kevin, you're not unmuted.
Kevin Jefferson, co-chair, attending remotely, also co-chair Bay Area Quality Management District.
Thank you. Ray Leone. Luis Almedo.
My name is Ruth Lopez. I'm actually the alternate for Ray Leone. So I apologize. I didn't realize my name showed up as Ray Leone. So my name is Ruth Lopez and I'm virtual. I'm out of Kings County, but Ray is the mayor of Huron and the executive director of the LEAP Institute.
Oh, okay, thank you. And then Luis Almedo. Jill Sherman Warren.
Jill Sherman Warren, pronouns she, her. I am attending virtually and I will leave my picture on because I'm in Hoopa, which is rural, and oftentimes it will either kick me out or freeze the whole thing. So I have to remain without my live person picture.
Thank you. And then Sharifa Taylor. Okay, perfect. So now I will go ahead and turn it over to our co-chairs to present the agenda for today.
This is Dr. Catherine. After introductions and opening remarks, we'll get to our two core agenda items. The first one is on cap and trade, and we'll have a couple of speakers and discussion. We'll take a quick break. Then we'll have our other substantive item, which is a discussion about carbon capture, use and storage, or CCUS, and direct air capture. We'll then go to public comment, and we will close as usual with the next steps and closing remarks.
So I will do our meeting agreements. I haven't been able to fix the sound, so hopefully this works. Pay attention to quality of airtime, be present, open, be open and flexible to our approaches, monitor our—
Miss Martha, you're really low.
Yeah, I'm trying, I don't
Do
know
you,
what.
do you want me to read the agreements?
Yes.
Pay attention to equity of airtime. Be present. Have openness and be flexible in our approaches. Be realistic and monitor our ability to get through the full agenda. Seek out synergies in our work. Yes, and using yes, and as we build on each other's comments and thoughts. Listen and be compassionate and supportive. Reach for and invite inspiration and intuition. Look for ways to move toward action where possible. Respect the agenda and trust the process. And share responsibility for the successes in all that we do.
Okay, so I think at this point I can kick it off with some brief opening remarks and then we can go around as co-chairs before we get into our first item on cap and trade. This is Dr. Catherine again. I just wanted to start by acknowledging how much work happens behind the scenes for us to be able to prepare for these meetings. Appreciate all of the offline conversations from co-chairs check-ins to the work group meetings. I know Carbon Markets met this morning. So, we all are putting in a lot of work in addition to showing up to these meetings that we are having about once a month now. I also wanted to acknowledge that internally we have debriefed on lessons learned from last meeting in terms of time management, flow, equity of airtime, all of those meeting agreements that Kevin Jefferson just went through. And so in the spirit of continual improvement, again, really want to encourage ongoing work towards achieving dialogue rather than talking past each other. And thank you to my work group members for helping prepare for both the cap and trade and the CCUS DAC conversations today. And with that, I'll pass it back to you, Kevin. Oh, except now I don't see Kevin on his Zoom screen. So how about we try you, Martha Dina, and see if your audio is better.
Is that better?
I think so.
Oh, good. Well, I mean, I want to say my opening remarks for the section on CCUS.
and we have a lot of speakers to get through, but we've been struggling with the cap and trade program for, since 2006. And I think this year the conversation feels like it's evolving, and we certainly hope that the lessons learned from the environmental justice community and how this is impacting them can actually be incorporated into the final regs and how we proceed with the cap and trade program, and begin to focus on direct emissions reductions, in a much more rapid pace. And I'm going to stop there because I'm conscious of how much we have to get through.
Thank you, Martha Dina. And I don't see Kevin Jefferson, so I think at this point I'll pass it over to Deputy Executive Officer for Equity, Communities, and Environmental Justice to make their. Oh, Kevin Jefferson, did you want to make any co-chair opening remarks before CARB does theirs?
No, I need to check in. I haven't. I apologize. I'll do the homework and be available and be ready.
Great. So over to you, Chanel.
All right. I will be really brief. I just wanted to welcome everyone and thank everyone for taking the time to be here today. So for those who don't know, my name is Chanel Fletcher, Deputy Executive Officer for Equity, Communities, and Environmental Justice. Definitely looking forward to the conversations we're going to have today as it relates to cap and trade and the other topics. I do want to welcome and thank the CARB deputies that are online with us today or in the room, as well as board members and or the chair's office. We really do appreciate your time and support in listening on these important conversations. As already probably indicated, EJAC will be discussing cap and trade regulation and the carbon capture, utilization, and storage and direct capture regulations. So the EJAC has invited a few guest speakers on these items to provide their perspective. So I will turn it back over to the EJAC co-chairs.
Thanks, Chanel. So with that, I think we'll proceed to item number 3, EJAC discussion of the cap and trade regulation. And I'm going to take a couple of minutes to get brief background and would also invite our speaker that's here with us, Sarah, to come join us. We have a spot for you with a name card. So thank you, CARB staff, for preparing that. So the what was formerly called the Cap and Trade Work Group that became the Carbon Markets Work Group to look at both the low carbon fuel standard and cap and trade has submitted comment letters both through the scoping plan process and through the pre-rulemaking process that CARB staff is currently undertaking when it comes to the cap and trade regulation. As Martha Dina acknowledged, this has been a longstanding concern for environmental justice communities, and we would like to see, as the program moves forward and is potentially extended in the legislature, and as CARB proceeds with its rulemaking, that there are real efforts to meaningfully address equity concerns. Staff so far has indicated that they plan to conclude the rulemaking process in 2024, so this is something as a work group that we have been actively watching, and I did give a brief report out at our last month's meeting about some of the conversations that have happened in the legislature that I've been a part of. And so to build off of those conversations and the slew of background documents that I shared with everyone and provided as background material for people to look through, I also wanted to invite a few of the speakers who were on some of those legislative panels with me to provide and share their expertise that I benefited from hearing when we were testifying in the legislature, so that we as a committee could stay up to speed with these conversations, because it is very much about the cap and trade program itself, and it is also about the funding that the cap and trade program generates through what's called GGRF, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. So that's not to say, of course, that we're not going to still make comments and take a deep look at the rulemaking process itself. But again, we are waiting for the actual proposal from CARB staff. So in the interim, we wanted to take the opportunity to hear from the Legislative Analyst's Office and then Danny Cullenward, who wears a couple of different hats. So I'll ask you both to introduce yourselves, but really interested in hearing short presentations from our expert speakers today about the work that their different entities do to understand and help analyze the cap and trade program and whether we're going to achieve both climate and equity goals through these programs. So Similar to previous meeting formats, we've asked the speakers to take 5 to 10 minutes to provide an overview. Their slides have been provided printed for those of you who are here in the room and online on the EJAC webpage for people who are virtual and would like to access it. EJAC members also received these attachments via email, so if you'd like to look at either some of the handout information that they provided or the slide decks, that all should be accessible to you. So first, we're going to hear from Sarah Cornett with the Legislative Analyst's Office, and then Danny. After each of them speak for 5 to 10 minutes, then we'll have an opportunity for discussion and questions among EJAC committee members. So again, please get ready to move on to the discussion section and just 10, 15 minutes or so, and do raise your hand if you'd like to weigh in. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sarah.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm Dr. Catherine for the introduction to our conversation today. My name is Sarah Cornett. I use they, them pronouns, and I cover climate and energy issues for the Legislative Analyst's Office. We are the state legislature's nonpartisan policy and fiscal advisor. So in particular, we work on state budget issues. We've over the past several years, have provided a lot of research reports on the cap and trade program and the greenhouse gas reduction fund. So with that, I'll dive right in. First, kind of talking a little bit about the cap and trade program. So just to kind of situate the conversation, our office, in our kind of assessment of the program and where we're at, we have found that cap and trade is currently not stringent enough to support meeting our state greenhouse gas reduction goals. So CARB's 2022 scoping plan, which I know EJAC was involved in, was following and engaged in those conversations. We found in a report last year that scoping plan lacked a clear strategy for meeting our upcoming 2030 GHG emissions goal in particular. And as part of that analysis, we found that the cap and trade program is not currently positioned to close that 2030 emissions gap that we need to get to achieve our statutory goals. So just to kind of situate this, like zooming out a little bit and thinking about these goals. So as you can see, the state met our 2020 goal early, ahead of schedule. However, our 2030 and 2045 goals are much more ambitious. And in the past, cap and trade has kind of been seen as this backstop, to the extent that other state programs and policies don't get us to where we need to be in terms of these goals. Cap and trade was expected to fill in the gap. That's not what we saw in the scoping plan. And in our understanding and kind of look at the program as it's currently designed, it's not really well situated to help us meet these ambitious goals. So one of the reasons this is the case is that this is going to get a little wonky, but happy to talk more and answer questions about this down the road too. Under the cap and trade program, so entities that are covered under the program, businesses, companies, they are able to purchase allowances that they can use to fulfill their compliance obligations. So there's no limit to the purchasing of allowances and deadline for using those allowances. So in theory, companies could have been purchasing allowances over the past several years when allowance prices were lower, and then use those allowances to meet their compliance obligations under the program over the next several years. So by doing so, they wouldn't actually be reducing their emissions, because cap and trade gives companies the option of whether they reduce their emissions, buy allowances to cover their emissions, or use offsets. So just emphasizing here that this figure shows, the program as it's currently designed. As Dr. Catherine mentioned, CARB is going through a rulemaking, with some of these concerns in mind. So this is pertaining to the current program. So turning now to the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, GGRF is the fund in which proceeds from the sale of cap and trade allowances are deposited. So CARB hosts 4 auctions each year of these allowances, and all of those dollars that get raised from the sale of state allowances go into GGRF. And in recent years, these auctions have raised between $3 billion and more than $5 billion, most recently. While it's difficult to forecast these revenues because we don't know for certain, what the market conditions will be like, where the allowance prices will settle, revenues have been trending upwards over the past several years. And then in terms of where this money goes, so most of this money goes to what we call continuous appropriation. So this is pre-established spending in set amounts. So these amounts were all determined through legislation, most of them 10 years ago, and some more recently. But essentially, the legislature has directed most of this money to a set number of programs in different percentages. So you see high-speed rail receives 25%, affordable housing 20%, and so on. And then the remaining revenue, so a little over 30%, is available for discretionary spending. So this remaining revenue gets kind of ironed out and allocated every year as part of the budget process with the governor negotiating with the legislature. So since GGRF began dispersing funds more than 10 years ago, most spending has concentrated on climate and environmental activities. And some of the largest categories of spending have been low carbon transportation programs, primarily at CARB, the AB 617 program, and a variety of agriculture programs, such as a program called Farmer, which does diesel agriculture tractor replacements. And according to CARB's data, 74% of GGRF spending has benefited priority populations. I just wanted to highlight, there's a really interesting new research out from USC that came out a couple months ago on kind of a closer look on where these monies have gone. So they're also known, GGRF spending is also known as California Climate Investment Spending. Just the same, that's under a slightly snazzier name. But the USC report did do a really deep dive into how this money has benefited communities, community experience of receiving the dollars, and some of those equity concerns. So would definitely recommend checking out that work. And then this is just kind of a depiction of how these dollars have been spent starting in 2013. So you see that those continuous appropriations, are getting most of the dollars. So high-speed rail, affordable housing, and then many other activities, dozens, there may even be hundreds of programs that have received GGRF funds. And then just to close, we wanted to kind of close with a couple of, considerations that we think are worth thinking about as we're in this important time with thinking about the future of the program. So we think it's worth considering as something we've been advising the legislature to, what are the highest spending priorities for these revenues? The legislature can always decide to spend the money on different things. What we have right now, we have those continuous appropriations. Those were created in statute and could always be adjusted. So especially as we think about some of the changes in CARB's rulemaking, there's a potential for the state to collect even more revenue in GGRF if the program becomes more stringent. So we think it's worth taking a look at that and thinking about priorities. And then finally, revenues could be used to mitigate some of the consumer cost impacts of cap and trade, particularly on lower income Californians. So I believe Danny is going to talk a little bit more about the kind of cost impacts of consumer costs of the cap and trade program on energy prices. We think it's maybe worth considering a GGRF revenues to help reduce that burden placed on lower income consumers, people, and in particular, potentially, rebating GGRF funds in a needs-based manner, something like that. And that's something we've kind of imposed to the legislature before. But that concludes my remarks. I welcome, happy to talk more about the program or GGRF if there's any interest, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Sarah. Definitely a lot of important information and food for thought. And kudos to the CARB staff team. I could have sworn you were controlling your slides with how seamless that advancement went. So definitely, I think a lot that we'll have comments and questions on there. And as you mentioned, Danny's presentation is also related. So we're going to go ahead and go to Danny Cullenward next, and then we'll bring it to EJAC for questions and discussion.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Catherine and members of the EJAC. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you in advance to CARB staff for help with the slides. My name is Danny Cullenward. I'm a researcher with the University of Pennsylvania. I use he, him pronouns. Next slide, please. I will be speaking to you today in my capacity as an individual researcher. I'm also a member of the Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee. I just want to make clear I'm speaking on behalf of myself and not on behalf of the committee today. So the issue I want to speak about today touches on and builds on some of the issues that Sarah's just brought up with the group, which is about some of the connections between the cap and trade program and the low carbon fuel standard, both of which are market-based climate policies implemented by the California Resources Board. And I want to focus specifically on cost impacts and mechanisms for addressing cost impacts that might be relevant. So the cap and trade program and please go back. Thank you. They both of these programs impose direct costs on the parties that emit greenhouse gas emissions. They also have indirect costs that affect consumers, typically through these programs, costs being passed through to higher energy prices. They create a number of economic benefits, both financial and environmental, and they have related cost impacts, but different choices and options across the two programs for how to think about affecting those cost impacts. So I want to hopefully give you some context for those options as we go. So the first question I want to answer is, to whom does the money flow in these programs? So money is flowing in these programs as we're reducing emissions. I wanted to give a quick sketch of the different ways the money flows. Sarah talked about how the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund is one of the important features of the cap and trade program, and it is. There's actually several other ways that money flows in the program. Some of the allowances to put greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere are given for free to utilities. Many of those allowances are required to be auctioned with the revenues rebated to consumers. And so if people have heard about the California Climate Credit, which recently came out, I think this last week, that money comes from these freely allocated allowances, and they result in rebates back to consumers. Other allowances are given for free to emitting industries to protect against the possibility that they'll close a shop and their competitor outside the state will simply emit in their place. There are carbon offset projects that receive funds and essentially bypass the allowance system. And so that's another category of actors who receive money under these programs. They're paid directly by the emitters. And then the allowances that CARB auctions for sale that the state owns raise money for the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that Sarah described. In the low carbon fuel standard, which is the transportation fuels carbon market we have in the state, the people who earn the money in that program are the people who sell fuels that emit less than the carbon intensity target that CARB has set for the program in that year. So it's essentially lower carbon fuels that year. People who sell higher carbon fuels have to pay them, have to buy their credits. Next slide, please. This is a quick data breakdown of the credit issuance in the low carbon fuel standard. Most of the credits to date, cumulatively about 80% of the credits in the low carbon fuel standard program have gone to a suite of different biofuel categories, including ethanol, biodiesel, biomethane, and renewable diesel. About 17% over this period cumulatively has gone to electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging stations. In 2022, that breakdown was a little closer to 75 and 25%, and that breakdown is likely to continue favoring electricity from its current relatively low levels as we go forward. But I just wanted to give you a sense of who is earning these credits in this program. This is data directly from CARB. Next slide, please. So who bears the costs in these programs? In the cap and trade program, it's large emitters that emit more than 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. But many of these emitters are likely to pass on some of these costs in the form of higher energy prices, including electricity, natural gas, and transportation fuels. The low carbon fuel standard only applies to transportation fuels. So companies that sell higher emitting fuels, and that basically means gasoline and diesel, essentially incur costs to comply with this program. And some or potentially all of those credit prices are going to be passed on to consumers, which will affect the consumer-facing price of gasoline and diesel. Next slide, please. Just to give you some sense, I won't walk through every step here, but this is the sort of standard way you can calculate what the consumer cost impact is under the Low Carbon Fuel Standard program. So if you take a gallon of fuel that's been sold, if it emits more carbon than the policy target for that year and incurs a deficit, and so you can calculate the per gallon of gasoline carbon deficit that fuel seller has to comply with. There's a market price for these low carbon fuel standard credits. And then you can make various assumptions about how much of that total program cost you think the fuel seller is going to pass on to consumers. And so this is a standard way you can go about trying to calculate these per gallon cost impacts. So one thing to note about the low carbon fuel standard program is as the program's carbon targets go down over time, as we're asking for more and more cleaner fuels, the cost impacts per gallon of gasoline or diesel also go up, because this calculation is based on the sort of per gallon deficit. And so as we lower our targets, that same gallon of gasoline, same gallon of diesel is going to incur a greater deficit and therefore have higher costs associated with it. Next slide, please. So how are cost impacts distributed? In both programs, the direct costs are borne by the emitters or the people selling the higher carbon fuels. And in both programs, indirect cost impacts are passed on to consumers in the form of higher energy prices. So this affects all of us. And I just wanted to draw those connections out on this slide. Next slide, please. This is essentially what I wanted to build up to help this committee understand some of the policy options and connections between the two programs, which have important roles to play in the state's decarbonization policy portfolio, but have different options for affecting how especially those indirect cost impacts to consumers manifest in practice. So one question you could ask is, how can different policy choices in these programs affect essentially who has to pay money, what the cost impacts are, including to consumers and households? And there's a number of tools that you can think about in the cap and trade program. So more allowances could be given for free to utilities that are required to rebate those allowances back to consumers. That's a way you can change essentially the net program cost to consumers. You could change offset policies. So when you allow carbon offsets into the program, some companies will be able to buy those offsets directly from the companies producing those offsets instead of buying allowances, for example, at the cap and trade auction, which would bring in money to the state. So you can bring in more money to the state if you have fewer offsets, potentially higher costs as well for that. You can also have choices around what money comes into the state through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And exactly as Sarah described, there's this large suite of portfolio of programs that have been funded and a lot of choices that have been made about how to spend those monies. You could either spend those funds in ways that directly target programs and communities that address some of the cost impacts. You could also think about rebating some of those funds directly to consumers, either through utility bill rebates or through other mechanisms. But there's quite a few choices in that program if you want to change the net outcome as to the consumer price impacts. I'm very much open to discussion if experts on the low carbon fuel standard can think of ways to do that with the low carbon fuel standard. I can't think of one, and I just wanted to contrast these two programs. They both have important roles to play, but I would argue to you there's a lot more choices in the cap and trade program if you want to focus on the overall price impact to consumers and ways we can mitigate those price impacts and really center the equity of the cost implications of these programs. Next slide, please. So this is essentially the bottom line message I wanted to share with the community. Both of these programs have significant impacts. They affect one another. They affect the indirect cost impacts and price of gasoline and diesel fuels. I would say that the cap and trade program has quite a few options that policymakers can exercise if they want to try and address consumer price impacts with the way that revenues flow in that program. And the last point I want to make is that choices in the one program are likely to constrain options in the other. Right now, the CARB is going through a formal rulemaking process that's temporarily on hold for the low carbon fuel standard. I believe next week we'll learn more about what CARB is proposing to do in the low carbon fuel standard. It's my belief that whatever CARB chooses to do in that program will affect and constrain the options for what can be done in the cap and trade program. So I think there's some value to thinking about how the two programs work and move together. And I wanted to introduce those connections. Next slide, please. This will be my last slide. I just wanted to very briefly touch on the annual report of the Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee, just to alert the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee to some of the work that we did this year. There's a link to the full report, which has a nice short introduction that summarizes all of this. The first chapter talks about some important but technical issues in greenhouse gas accounting that may have undermined the ambition of our long-term climate targets and call for some focus on how we treat biofuels in particular in the greenhouse gas inventory accounting system. It's a technical issue, but it may be of relevance to this group. The second chapter focuses on affordability making, I think, an important point, which is the more we rely on well-run markets, we can expect lower overall costs. But we also have these consumer price impacts that we have to think about and that were the subject of my presentation today. The third chapter was on how the cap and trade program in California is currently linked to a program in Quebec and might in the future link to a similar program in Washington State. And the committee recommended that that link move forward as a sound basis. The two programs, at least the view of the committee was that this is a good thing to pursue and that the program in Washington State is at least as stringent as the California program. I think that's a very fair statement. The last chapter I wanted to mention is probably the one that is of the most interest to this community in this conversation. There is a chapter introducing some issues associated with carbon capture and storage and carbon removal, or CCUS as it's sometimes called. I would describe this as a preliminary discussion, but it's very likely that the Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee will continue to do more substantive work this year on these issues. And I wanted to make sure this committee was aware of that, and I will be sure to reach out to the EJAC co-chairs when we have a sense of the schedule for that, because it's very important to us that we continue the collaboration between the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee and the Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee. We want to make sure that there's engagement and participation when the IEMAC comes around to those issues. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Looking forward to answering any questions and the discussion that follows. Thanks.
Thank you, Danny, and again to Sarah. So I'm going to make a few comments and kind of pull a few ideas together, and we are segueing now into the questions and comments section for EJAC members. So if you would like to get in the queue, since everybody except for me is on Zoom, please raise your virtual hand. I did want to acknowledge and appreciate the ongoing dialogue that the Carbon Markets Work Group has had with the Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee. So thank you for highlighting those aspects of the report, Danny. And just to remind committee members, I did share a letter that myself and colleague Dan Ress at Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment submitted in response in terms of some of the concerns and gaps that we had in terms of that 2023 report. While we may not agree with the ultimate role of the cap and trade program between EJAC and the IEMAC, that doesn't mean that we can't still have productive substantive dialogue about aspects of the program that we think need to improve. Also really appreciate Danny making the program connections between the low carbon fuel standard and cap and trade. Since I've been tasked with helping keep carbon markets moving as a conversation, it's essential that we understand those interconnections. And to Danny and Sarah both for helping us understand the significance of the cap and trade program in meeting our goals, and also the revenues, which is an important and complementary piece of it. So definitely alarmed to hear in the LAO analysis that we are not on track to meet our goals and that there are issues with cap and trade that are going to need to be addressed. So really wanted to lift up and reiterate what EJAC has said from the beginning of our process in providing feedback on the scoping plan, is that the focus really needs to be on direct reductions first, that we have to go as far as we can, as fast as we can when it comes to direct reductions. But meeting those, how we meet those goals is just as important as meeting those goals. We can't do it in a way that continues to exacerbate and increase the pollution crisis in frontline environmental justice communities. So one of the recommendations that our work group made was to eliminate free allowances, just to make the connection to one of the gaps that both Sarah and Danny were pointing to. There was also a request from a member in the chat to share the USC research looking at the GGRF expenditures. So we will, I will get the link to that and forward that so that people have that information available. And again, want to reiterate what I shared in my testimony in the legislature and what we as a work group have discussed a lot in terms of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund expenditures, that there's a big difference between saying that money has been spent in a disadvantaged community and that it's actually benefited households that live in disadvantaged communities. In the San Joaquin Valley, we see a repeated pattern of large incentives to industry that qualify because they're spent in a disadvantaged community, but they're benefiting the zip code and not the households themselves. So really wanting to make sure that we shift our focus there. And want to advance a conversation that colleague Juan Flores at CRPE and I had over the summer with the IEMAC in a conversation about how can we make sure we're more substantively addressing equity issues with the revenues. EJAC has previously recommended cap and dividend and really want to give a lot of credit to Juan for talking about how we don't just need cap and dividend for low-income households, we need it for all of the priority populations in California, including those that are unhoused, that don't qualify by zip code or don't qualify by getting a rebate on their utility bill, and those that are undocumented, to really make sure we're addressing equity issues in California. So wanted to pull together a couple of pieces and thoughts there. And so again, kind of want to hold this tension for the committee around the fact that we're talking about the cap and trade program itself, its interconnections with the low carbon fuel standard, and also where the expenditures go. And so at this point, I want to turn back to committee members for other comments or questions on this item or for our speakers. Kevin Hamilton, I see you have your hand raised, and then Juan, go ahead.
Sure. Again, thanks for being here. I really appreciate the two discussions. What I did want to touch bases on, I didn't see in the discussion. Danny was, and again, you know, the work that you guys do over there is just remarkable, and I really appreciate it. And you've been very helpful to us over the years. In helping us to better understand how the process works, what you're doing. And I think more importantly, how many recommendations IUMAC has made that haven't been implemented that could have helped the program improve. So one of those is credit retirement. I didn't really hear you go into that at all today. Could you touch briefly on that?
Thank you, Kevin. Could you clarify what you mean by credit retirement? Happy to answer your question.
Credits retired after a certain number of years, right? And new credits come into the market. So there's been comments and concerns over the years that the retirement rate after so many years is being extended. Every auction, a certain number of credits are designed to be, by design, retired. Let Juan go ahead. I've got a family thing calling me on the phone again and again.
Great. I'm happy to come back when you're ready. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Kevin. Go ahead, Juan.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we do got to make sure that these market mechanisms are truly impacting our communities on a way that is positive to them, right? And I might sound like a broken record, but the community members that I represent, these are the things that they struggle with every day, right? Like, we are hit by pollution directly on a daily basis, and often it's not even quantifying, because most of the pollution, I'll give you an example, flaring from oil and gas drilling. Often most of the pollution from flaring happens in the middle of the night when there's no inspectors, there's no nothing, right? Anyway, but pollution is already there. And we continue as a state selling credits to all these industries, but to a program that it does make a lot of revenue. But our community members do not see those revenues invested on their communities directly. And often when some of those revenues do come to the communities, they're often given to the industry who already have the duty to update their equipment, buy equipment that pollutes the list, that doesn't really impact their communities. But they often receive all this money, and community members don't see any of that, right? Instead of us investing in solar panels, instead of investing on more access to clean energy to our communities that are going to see tangible changes, we often give it back to the industry. And yeah, I can see the argument of saying, well, we're giving it to the industry so they can update their equipment. But then again, we're subsidizing industries that already see a lot of subsidies. A lot of tax credits are given to these communities, to these industries, but our communities do not see any of that. So I think that as we approach and as we're having these conversations, we ought to say, and we ought to think, how can we better impact the communities directly? Not on the sides, not on the outsides, but really within the communities. How can we make these communities that have suffered for decades, that have been left behind for decades, how do we ensure that they get the benefit that they need? Without demonizing them, right? Because I also hear people, and I have heard people saying, all that you want is welfare, more welfare for people. Well, isn't that the thing we're doing for the industry? Rather that we just call it subsidies. And our communities need some of that subsidies directly to them. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. And again, appreciate all the work you put in prepping with me as a work group member, and want to acknowledge that Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment has been organizing around the cap and trade program and its adverse impacts on environmental justice communities for decades. So really appreciate the work of CRPE on this. Kevin Jefferson, go ahead.
Yes, I just wanted to ask them in the report, they allude to the fact that the cap and trade program is not necessarily helping the low-income fence line communities. One way in which the electrical cost has increased. My question is this: the state, voted to allow PG&E to increase the fees. In 2023, PG&E had $20 billion annual profits. So in your reporting or in your conversations as to how change can be made, is there some conversation with the negotiations with PG&E as to how their profit margin can help decrease the cost of the fence line in low-income communities with this increased electrical billing?
I'd be happy to touch on that and welcome. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask Kevin to clarify, which report are you talking about?
The EMEAC.
Okay, great. Yeah, and then go ahead, Danny.
All right,
Sure.
EMAC, IEMAC report 2023.
We say IEMAC, yeah, and it's quite a
IEMAC.
mouthful. I apologize for that. No, we haven't touched on that directly. Maybe a couple of quick comments, and I'll look to Sarah if Sarah has anything to add on this. I appreciate that these programs are very complicated. I can barely keep my head around it as somebody who spends a big chunk of my time professionally on it. One of the things that I think's been a failure of the cap and trade program is not being able to communicate more clearly that the cost impacts to electricity consumers are really pretty well handled right now through this rebating program. So for customers of investor-owned utilities, including PG&E, the fact that the utilities are given, arguably as many allowances as they need and maybe a little bit more, they are required to auction those and return those revenues back to consumers. So there's actually a pretty good effect here where the California Climate Credit is doing a pretty good job of covering the costs of just this program. Now, as you suggest, Kevin, the cost impacts to utility rates right now are much larger, and it's primarily coming from other issues other than these market-based climate policies, like our wildfire problems and the cost of upgrading the grid. And as you suggest, some of the companies involved here have very large profit margins. So we've not directly addressed that, but I think it's really important to hear that as to the wonky machinery of the cap and trade program, money's actually going back to utility ratepayers in this program. And if that's something you like, there's something we could do more of that in the future. That's a choice that policymakers have in this program, if that's a direction they want to pursue. But it's not enough money to offset the cost increases that are coming from other areas. And so I want to uplift and acknowledge the issue of utility affordability. It is not driven by this program. And if anything, this program is probably helping a little on the margin. It could help more, but it alone will not be enough in terms of the size of the fiscal flows that are required to address this problem. And so other sources of money will be needed to bring utility rates under control. I hope that's helpful, and I welcome any thoughts from Sarah or others.
Well, I would just like to say that, maybe in the conversations, the cost of doing business is the cost of the electrical bills that are on the communities that are heavily impacted. Instead of having conversations, or along with having conversations about the great benefits of offsets to corporations, have the conversation of what does it cost to correct these ills of these corporations that are receiving these offsets and perks and things of that nature. So I think that we should put the problem in front of the relationships and partnerships with these corporations. We are not calculating the cost of the human impact of these businesses. We have all these conversations about climate action, climate plans, all of that good nature. But at the end of the day, it's about how can the corporations profit better and how can we set minimal limitations so that these corporations can exceed in their businesses. Because at the end of the day, we're just reducing the policing in essence and allowing them to run rampant, which allows their profit margins to increase tremendously.
I just wanted to maybe add one other point to your initial question, Kevin. I think Danny summarized it really, really well. But in terms of the utility costs, like the costs that ratepayers bear due to cap and trade, I think Danny's absolutely right that those costs are actually under the climate credit. I don't know where you all are utility customers, but I know for me, I think Tuesday I got my email from PG&E saying my climate credit was applied to my bill. So, there's many, as Danny said, there's many other things that are, really driving rates to levels we've never seen. But in terms of other cost impacts for cap and trade, while the utility costs, the costs associated with electricity may be offset, gasoline price cost is one that is not really offset. So our office estimates that, as of the most recent auction in February, that allowance price is adding about 30 cents to every gallon of gas. So unlike the electricity, the climate credit, which helps reduce that burden, the kind of transportation fuel costs are not really offset in the same way. So we obviously people don't live single issue lives, like our utility bills and our gas bills, but they're all coming out of one income. But just something, just kind of wanted to bring up that point as well.
Thank you, Sarah and Danny. Kevin Jefferson, was there anything else?
No, thank you.
So we'll go back to your question, Kevin Hamilton.
Great, thanks, and sorry for the disruption there. So back to credit retirement. So credits were designed to be retired at the point that whatever they are being issued against was whatever emission strategy in that company for reducing this greenhouse gas was achieved, right? So then they cash them in, so to speak, retire them, and all is well. That was sort of back when, in 2006 to 2011, that was our understanding of what was going to happen. So instead, what has happened is these things have become, in essence, a corporate sustainability tool. It's become a tool that is traded actively on markets, that companies that aren't doing their job, aren't getting those reductions, can sell them off to other companies who say that they will. And so it's actually becoming a tool that corporations are sort of building in as part of their sustainability programs. And that's not what was, and so on the backside of that are also the free credits. So why would I give free credits to PG&E? You suggest that when those credits are resold, they're not actually returned to the market. They're sold, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Danny.
Yeah, they're given for free to the investor-owned utilities. The investor-owned utilities are required to sell them, and they're required to use the revenues to rebate to consumers.
Exactly. So these are companies, these IOUs are making hundreds of millions of dollars every year. And yet, rather than having them support these communities that are actually making this money for them and that they're profiteering on, and that they have become the only service provider. It's not like this is a standard model where we have corporations that are competing with SCE or PG&E to provide power to these homes, they really only have one sole source provider. So it seems ridiculous on its face that we would, number one, give them free credits. But number two, the idea that a company that is issued a credit can then sell it to another company who can then sell it to another company and then sell it to another one. And along the way, everybody's making money. Now, while the IOUs have to return that money, the others don't. And so some of these credits, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, were issued, we're working on close to 20 years ago now, or 15 years ago anyway. I never got the sense that it was designed to work that way. And then we're adding more new credits into the market. Now, we thought we were going to see more and more credits retiring, and there are some that are, but not nearly at the rate that we need them to retire. Obviously, looking at Sarah's presentation, thank you for that great presentation, to meet our targets. That would seem to be a critical weakness in this program, almost a built-in failure into the program. And I'd love to hear your comments on it.
Yeah, I mean, you put me in an interesting spot, Kevin, and we've had the pleasure of speaking together for many years, so I hope you'll appreciate this. But for folks who haven't been following this conversation, I've gotten a lot of trouble over the years for pointing out some of the same problems you just brought up. So I'm very
I guess I'm notorious for that. I'm sorry, but these are important things to talk about, right? This is it. This is the crux of the biscuit, as Frank would have said, right?
For sure. And so, again, I would refer folks to Sarah's presentation, which does a nice job of with pictures showing how the fact that more allowances were introduced into the program than were needed, it led to a large bank. So the program isn't really binding. And it means the program hasn't really asked terribly much of polluters. Now, if you want to fix that process, and I do, and to CARB's credit, in the workshop process they're running, they are talking about substantial changes that would go a long way towards addressing this particular problem. It's also going to increase costs for the allowances and cost impacts for consumers. And this is where, to Kevin Jefferson's question, I'm really interested in focusing on where does the money go? Because if you require more of that money to go back to people, either in the form of rebates or in the form of programs that other members of the EJAC talked about, are these going to really benefit the actual communities or just companies in those communities? Where the money goes back can help address some of those concerns and help make it politically possible to both impose higher costs on emitters and ensure that some of the benefits of this program are being concentrated in the consumer and environmental justice communities that also pay the price through these indirect cost impacts. So I hear you loud and clear on that. I want to make the case that if this program is successfully reformed and made more stringent to address Kevin Hamilton's concerns, we're going to get more benefits. We're going to cause more emission reductions. And if we design the revenue side of this program well, we can compensate lower income households effectively for those higher costs. And to Juan Flores's point earlier, a cap and trade program is not designed to go after a particular source flaring in the middle of the night, and it never will be the solution to highly localized impacts. And so I also, in making the case for why strengthening this program and fixing some of its problems and centering equity and cost impacts is important, it's not a replacement for going after some of those direct local environmental justice considerations that really remain fundamentally the concern of the air districts in the state at this point in time. So I wanted to give that longer answer, both to acknowledge and uplift some of the very important criticisms that frankly I learned about from the environmental justice community, and also to make the case, if we solve this effectively, there can be better outcomes, potentially in a way that will resonate with many of the folks in this conversation today.
I hope they listen to you as well, Danny.
Thank you, Danny and Kevin Hamilton. Kevin Hamilton, did you have anything else?
No, other than, well, I take that back. So there's the other piece of this that you just raised here in this moment, and that was discussed, somebody brought up earlier, I think it might have been just Catherine, when you were talking about what we've talked about in the past. We reconciled ourselves, some of us, that we're not going to kill this program and replace it with tax and dividend, which is what a lot of us believe makes a lot more sense with strong regulation. However, there has to be a policing mechanism in here somewhere. So if there's players that are using this strictly as a profiteering tool, and they're in no way, shape, or form moving forward with actually reducing emissions, then they're just using the program again for their corporate sustainability or profit. And there needs to be a way to sort out. I mean, what do you think about sort of a modified program that in that modification sorts out that after a certain number of years of owning credits, if you've made no progress, and someone would have to establish what progress, means and how you measure that you're no longer eligible to participate in this program and you fall back into the regulatory environment.
So I personally think that those are really sound ideas. I can't say that I've heard them get any traction in the workshop process today. But no, I think it's a really fair suggestion to say if people are not on track, they shouldn't get some of the benefits of the flexibility of this program. But that's a policy decision. I think it's fair to say that is not a direction CARB has expressed an interest in, but given that there may be legislative reauthorization of the program, those kinds of ideas may be important to uplift in that process. I don't know what to say other than I hear you loud and clear. The one place I'll push back is I don't think there's weird profiteering going on here. I think we've had a program that is fundamentally pretty lax and hasn't asked a lot of people in the past. And the challenge I will offer you is if we want to fix that together, there will be higher cost impacts for everybody, including consumers. And so we need to center how to mitigate those cost impacts if we want to make this program do something, recognizing it will never be a replacement for the full spectrum of environmental justice concerns that require direct regulation at the local level. That's my personal view, and I hope that resonates.
It does. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thank you, Kevin Hamilton. Again, part of why I started my opening remarks with it takes direct reductions first, and we definitely need to focus there. So we have about 15 or 20 minutes left on this item for other folks who would like to ask comments or questions. I do have a couple of questions myself, but I'm going to put myself at the back of the queue. So next I see Matt, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add some narrative flesh to the conversation that we were just having about program participants. We've got a project that intends to utilize LCFS credits. It's going to be located in Riverbank in Stanislaus County because there happens to be an old Army ammo base. And it's going to be refining animal fats from India for sustainable aviation fuels. So we're going to ship animal fats from India to California, where we kind of raise some animals already. We've got no shortage of animal fats. It's going to bring dozens of additional ocean-going vessels into Stockton, dead center of our AB 617 emission reduction map, the dirtiest engine in our community. And it's going to add thousands of trucks to already overburdened. If you've been to Riverbank Modesto, you can't get anywhere in that place. And so, the cognitive dissonance of shipping animal fats around aviation fuels, applied research in a community that most people feels a little gross, but I think it also is a credibility challenge to the CARB and the entire cap and trade program. Like, this is a boondoggle, and so Kevin Ham. A retrospective for how to see if somebody's on track. This thing should never be started. This feels really absurd. And they're talking about taking tens of millions of dollars in welfare from the state of California to a community that's already dying early and low income. Just to give some narrative and some flesh to how some of these things are playing out, the audience can sort of tease out how this works in the real world. And but I did have a question, and anybody's welcome to comment on my characterization if they want. But I do have a question, Danny, which is, you mentioned earlier how, the LCFS rulemaking will impact the cap and trade program overall, and what that dynamic looks like. You got any more detailed nodes in that dynamic what do you see coming in the rulemaking, the impact how cap and trade moves forward?
Thank you, Matt. I have to say about the most positive thing I can say about the low carbon fuel standard is if it were significantly reformed and we were redirecting the funding towards a lot of other things, not the things we're currently funding, I could get excited about it.
And real quick, policymakers have complete discretion over how to shape how this money is spent, right? Like, I mean, this is
it's kind of a weird program because it's not, there's some ambiguity about exactly how it's authorized, but it's never been explicitly authorized by the legislature. I'm not saying it lacks authority. I think it very clearly has some statutory authority, but it's a creation entirely at the Air Resources Board. And so what CARB has decided to credit is what gets credited. And if you have concerns with that, as I do as well, that could be changed. And I think a big question is whether or not it will be changed. Look, I'll just get really blunt with you, Matt. I got in a little trouble for the legislative testimony I gave with Dr. Catherine back in February, where I referenced how at the time CARB was planning to take a vote on the low carbon fuel standard to approve the amendments that would add substantial cost impacts to the price of gasoline and diesel. So the project you mentioned is paid for by drivers, just as it's paid for by the refiners who sell fuels into the state. And if, policymakers are going to ask California drivers to pay a lot of money to subsidize, importing animal fats to refine in your community, I imagine those drivers are going to be less interested in fixing the cap and trade program. And I will say to you that as between the two programs, the cap and trade program facilitates more easily a conversation about returning money back to people and directly addressing consumer price impacts. So I would be concerned if decisions around subsidizing biofuels prejudiced our ability to have a focused conversation on how to make sure these programs balance consumer affordability and are designed with rebates and cost impacts in mind, which are not tools that are currently part of the low carbon fuel standard program. And therefore, if that program goes first without a coherent view about how to balance the two programs, it will prejudice our ability to think about cost impacts because we're all going to pay for these projects, including the ones we don't like. So that's why I've brought this up. I've tried to, in my presentation, make this as dry and defensible as possible. But the primary motivation for me is if we subsidize biofuels and basically make drivers pay for that, it is going to be harder to have a conversation about increasing the economy-wide cap and trade program price, where we have the tools to directly go after cost impacts and to say, let's figure out a way where everybody feels like they're going to be protected and we can balance these concerns. You can't really do that in the low carbon fuel standard policy on its own. So I share many of your concerns, and I worry that the sequencing could lead us to a worse outcome than we would have if we thought comprehensively about the two programs together.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It does help. I think there's also sort of a history of people and how they interact with their resources board and its policies. This particular company is shuttering its ethanol plant because it ran out of subsidies to keep that business penciling out. And so they conned the local government into creating a facility in a nearby town. They had a cliff, state funded it. It's over. Now that facility is going to be mothballed. And we're bribing somebody into starting a new business in a disadvantaged community with limited economic opportunity that's got a short future. I think there's a way to screen some of these projects earlier, and I hope that's part about how we get cap and trade back on track.
All right, so as we come close to wrapping up this item, again, last call for any EJAC members who have comments or questions. Just also wanted to remind members of the public who have raised their hands that public comment will happen later on this afternoon. So do raise your hand to get in the queue and know that it'll be a bit until we get to you. Also wanted to express solidarity with you, Danny, about getting in trouble for your legislative comments. I definitely got in trouble also, or got some heat, I would say, for calling out the fact that the Community Air Protection Program, that is a chunk of the GGRF funds, definitely has a lot of remaining gaps in it and improvements that need to be made. Even though CVAC and our members are committed to continual improvement and working on it, I think some people were still unhappy about the fact that I called out some of the problems with the program. But again, that's what we're here to do, right? And that's the role of the EJAC, is to talk about the equity implications of these decisions, not just the programs themselves, but also the revenue that they generate. So really appreciate that. So again, if other EJAC members have comments or questions, get in the queue. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead with my two questions and wrap it up with some next steps. So one EJAC recommendation that I already uplifted was the eliminate free allowances. Another thing that we have talked a lot about has been issues with carbon offsets. And I don't know if that's something that the LAO office looks at, but I know, Danny, that that's also something you have some expertise in. So I'm going to turn to you first, Sarah, if you all have any info on some of the issues and gaps with carbon offsets, and then to you, Danny.
We I think share many of the concerns that researchers have raised about the value and the quality of those offsets. We haven't done really extensive work on it, but I'll turn it to Danny, who is more knowledgeable and can talk in more depth about those concerns.
Thank you, Sarah. I've been a researcher who's been involved in some of the critical studies. The Independent Emissions Market Advisory Committee has recommended CARB take a look at some of those earlier studies. Here's what I would say. We have 6 or 7 major peer-reviewed studies at this point that have found massive problems with the carbon offsetting program. CARB has committed to address one of those issues by funding a research project that might inform future updates. They indicated at the legislative oversight hearing back in February that they won't be making any changes to the carbon offsets program in the upcoming workshop process. There are really massive problems in this program. I don't think most of the credits are real or permanent. And that's just sort of where we are. So about 80% of the offset credits come from crediting carbon stored in forests. There's a lot of evidence that we're giving too many of those credits, or we're giving credits to forests that were going to be protected anyway. My favorite example is there's a timber company that has a conservation easement that says you cannot cut down these trees, but nevertheless, for the purposes of earning carbon offset credits in this program, they were allowed to say that they would cut down trees that they're legally prohibited from cutting down, and they were given offset credits on that basis. Now, that is probably the most flagrant example that exists, but it exists, and I can't say the rest of it looks much better from my perspective, and that's been a huge part of the compliance structure to date. So Kevin Hamilton brought up, there's this large bank of credits, and Sarah's presentation talked about how people bought and held on to these extra credits. One of the big reasons that happened is because we gave a lot of carbon offsets away as well. So I have concerns about how that program is run, and I think it's fair to say CARB does not share a single one of them, and that's about all I can add.
Thanks, Danny. And it's been quite a while since I've brought up the parallel program in the San Joaquin Valley, horribly mismanaged by our air district, that is a bank for criteria air pollutants that has been horribly corrupted with all kinds of fake and overvalued credits, but seems like a good time to make that parallel, that we know just intuitively there are going to be issues with problems when you try to quantify and write down on paper emissions that happened decades ago that somehow today still have the same value, or when staff are negotiating with industry over how to kind of loosely interpret the rules to get around to make something happen on paper that hasn't actually happened. Fundamentally, these types of programs are designed to benefit industry and not low-income communities. And in fact, unfortunately, we see the opposite. And then we sit back and wonder why the San Joaquin Valley is still the most polluted air basin for fine particles when we're running a paper game, but we're not actually ensuring that there are real reductions on the ground. So it seemed like a good time to bring that parallel issue back up with our emissions reduction credit system. So I'm also continue always to be struck by the point on your opening slide, Sarah, about cap and trade currently not being positioned to close the 2030 emissions gap. And the fact that there's still strong debate over CARB counting cap and trade as a direct reduction where, really it is a backstop measure. So one of the conversations that happened in the legislature that I think it's really important to revisit here is, what are the risks if the program isn't improved so that it's able to actually help CARB meet its goals? And again, I'll go to you first, Sarah.
Yeah, well, I thank you for lifting that up. I think so something that is worth acknowledging is that, cap and trade alone isn't going to get us to these goals. It's one tool in the larger toolbox we have of climate and environmental programs that reduce emissions. However, it is a big policy tool, and one that we do have some ability to make adjustments to as CARB is considering. So I do think, if CARB does not make changes to the program, which seems very unlikely given that the rulemaking is ongoing. There is definitely a risk that, you know, the program can't really support us to meet our ambitious goal. Something else that I didn't touch on, but also feels relevant to that question is just the question of reauthorization of the program. So currently it's set to expire in 2030, the cap and trade program. It's a little unclear, the kind of legal authority to extend is a little bit unclear. However, you know, the legislature could extend the program beyond 2030 as it did in 2017 to its current date. I think that's you know, another question. If the legislature kind of drags its feet on extension and we don't see extension for, you know, a couple of years, you know, closer to 2030, I think that also could, you know, run the risk of, you know, potentially making it more difficult for us to meet those goals. But I welcome Danny for any of your thoughts on that question as well.
No, I think that's right. And I've expressed, you know, a number of criticisms here. I was very negative on the offsets program, but I also want to give CARB staff credit. The reforms they're talking about in the workshop process would, I think, substantially address some of these concerns. And I think it's going to be a lot harder. It's going to be very difficult for us to meet our climate goals if we don't have this program. So I will join, you know, Kevin and Juan and others pointing out this cannot replace the direct action that's required, particularly to address historical inequities and ongoing inequities. But life's a lot harder and pollution gets worse if we don't have this program. And to me, the best of all possible outcomes is fixing this program and continuing that work that needs to be done, not allowing this to become a replacement for direct regulation, particularly of the non-greenhouse gas, the local air pollutants. But I just make a plea to this community. I know folks are critical of this program, and I'm even more critical of the low carbon fuel standard. We are better off with the cap and trade program than we are without it, so long as it doesn't replace the other tools and efforts that are needed. And the best outcome is where we strengthen both of them. And I hope folks will take that to heart, only because life is going to get a lot harder and polluters will have, frankly, an easier burden if they're not required to pay for their pollution, however inadequately we've priced it to date. And I'll be the first person to stand up and explain how those deals got done. We can do better going forward.
Thank you, Danny. Martha Dina, did you want to comment?
Well, yes. I mean, I think the comment of that without the direct emissions reductions and actually remembering that CARB is there and the air districts are there to regulate air emissions. But we've been saying that since 2006 and it's not happening. And so I just think that, you know, if there was ever a moment to actually focus on air pollution, this is it. And so I would hope that CARB staff takes our recommendations that we've made, including around data collection and transparency and the adaptive management program, because for a lot of our communities, the sense that air pollution is getting better is not real, right? So you may have reduced carbon emissions, but is air quality actually getting better, perceptibly better for communities? And so, you know, I'm just stuck there, Danny.
I hope you don't hear me arguing against you. I hear that, and I will do everything I can to uplift the point that even the best designed cap and trade program will not resolve all of those issues. The much more modest argument I'm making is that we're better able to accomplish our air quality and our climate goals with a well-designed program than without any program. And I appreciate that this program has sometimes been used as a shield to say we don't need to do the things that we actually need to do to clean up local air quality. And I will be right there with you if somebody, you know, lies about that again.
Thank you, Danny. And I think along those lines, we also often hear, well, but it generates so much money and it goes to disadvantaged communities, which again, you know, we're not seeing it in the San Joaquin Valley. So I'm stuck right there with you, Martha Dina, right? There's so much unfinished business of the original commitments of achieving clean air for our communities. And to give somewhat of an explicit response to my own question of what are the risks, because this was part of what was really robustly discussed on those legislative panels, is it is one tool in the toolbox, cap and trade, but if it fails, that means we lean more heavily on all of the other tools in the toolbox, and all of those are also at risk, right? Are we going to reduce vehicle miles traveled to the level that we've said we're going to? Well, if not, then we're going to have to lean more heavily on other things, including technologies like carbon capture, use and storage, and direct air capture, that if we foregrounded and prioritized doing the right thing first, we wouldn't necessarily have to fall back on, right? And so there are real stakes involved here, and they are all interconnected pieces, right? Whether one program is successful or not is going to have implications for if we're able to achieve the overall roadmap. So I do want to segue also to making a couple of concluding comments and talking about next steps that the work group has agreed to. But first, I wanted to just go back to Sarah and Danny to see if you all had any closing thoughts that you all wanted to share with us as we wrap up this item.
Well, yeah, I did just, want to add one comment, but thank you first so much for having us. And this was a great discussion. Really happy to be speaking with you and hear your questions and concerns. It's really helpful for us. I think I just wanted to also leave you with, I think from our perspective, we work for the legislature. We're kind of helping, we're the legislature's eyes and ears, as our motto goes, on kind of policy and budget issues. So as we're talking about CARB's rulemaking, like CARB does have the authority to make changes to the program, is currently in a rulemaking. However, the legislature can always interject and direct CARB to make certain changes, modify the program, as the legislature did in 2017 with AB 398. So I think that's something I would just pose to the committee. It's worth, obviously advocating to CARB through the rulemaking process, but also talking to legislators. And if there are things that, that you feel like really need to be front and center, and that maybe there's not the capacity or interest in doing in the rulemaking, that is an option. Legislators can make changes as well. So just want to encourage, kind of uplift that side of those tools in the toolbox for making changes as well. But thank you very much again.
I'll echo the thanks. I really appreciate the chance to speak with you all. I really value the connections and conversations with both the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee and the broader NGO community that works on these issues. So thank you for your time. I'll just echo what Sarah said, particularly on the point that if you're interested in rebates or the revenue side, how to spend the money in cap and trade, that is a conversation that likely requires legislative involvement. So CARB has a lot of discretion over how to design the program and the rules of the program, but how money gets spent is always an appropriations-based process. And so if that's an area of interest to this group, I think that Sarah's advice is extra important to follow, because there's, that is the forum where if anybody wants to say, let's change the way money is being spent, it's going to be through a combined regulatory and legislative process. So thank you again. Happy to answer any questions and follow up, and appreciate everyone's time.
And on behalf of the whole committee and the Carbon Markets Work Group, thank you both for coming and speaking with us and sharing your expertise. It was great synchronicity and probably not coincidental, since we were on legislative panels today, that my closing remark was that reauthorization of cap and trade is a huge opportunity for us to weigh in the legislature in terms of what the future of this program looks like, because CARB has a role to play, but so does the legislature, right? And again, it was in 2017 that not only did cap and trade get extended, but AB 617 got enacted, right? So those were companion pieces. Those are things that still were considered down payments that need to be improved on. And we know that we want to keep emphasizing real reductions and reforms for the program, both within CARB, but also from the legislature. And so one of the next steps that is really important, that is one of our other recommendations that we actually haven't spoken about today, is that for a long time, EJAC has been strong in recommending either facility level caps or no trade zones in order to address the increasing air pollution in environmental justice communities where these polluting industries tend to be clustered and located. And, we know that for a fact. There's plenty of evidence for it. We still do not have clarity from CARB staff whether they actually have the authority themselves to implement no trade zones, or whether that will require direction from the legislature. So I am putting that down on our list of unanswered questions that we need a response to from CARB staff, to be clear. And I also do want to make an explicit request on the record that we have someone who is a part of this rulemaking process from Industrial Strategies Division come and give us a 5 to 10 minute update out of respect for equity of airtime at the EJAC meeting following when the initial kind of proposal comes out. On the expenditures and revenues end, again, recognizing that there is a kind of complementary role between CARB and the legislature. CARB does not determine the way that GGRF funds are spent, but they do every 5 years put together a plan of recommended expenditures that they forward to the legislature. So a few weeks ago on a co-chair call, Martha Dina and I heard from the California Climate Investments team. They are in a workshop process right now, getting feedback on what they will put in their next 5-year plan that they will then pass to the legislature as their set of recommendations for where they think the money should go. So that is another opportunity, not only for us to weigh in through those workshops, but in consulting with work group members, we will also be following up and inviting the CCI Investments Plan team to come to a future EJAC meeting so that we can provide them feedback on what EJAC has already recommended that we would like to see recommended in their expenditures plan, like some of the things we've discussed today, like cap and dividend. So in terms of next step, further discussion on cap and trade, that will definitely be ongoing as the rulemaking process is moving forward. A request to ISD staff for an update once their proposed rule is out, and an invitation to the CCI team to a future meeting to present on expenditures. And with that, I think that we can go ahead and wrap this item almost exactly on time. And next we'll be taking should we still do 15 minutes? Now or at the after? Okay, sorry, we're going to take a break in a minute, but first we need to do a roll call before we take a break. So yeah, I'll go ahead and pass it back to CARB staff. But thank you again, Danny and Sarah, and to all of the committee members for such a great discussion.
So there's just a few EJAC members who weren't here or able to verbally introduce themselves during roll call. So we're just going to have those members introduce themselves now. Please be sure to state your name, affiliation, and pronouns for everybody. So first we have Kevin Hamilton.
Hi, Kevin Hamilton, Senior Director, Government Affairs for Central California Asthma Collaborative.
Thank you. Next we have John Harriel Jr.
John Harriel, IBW Local 11, he, him, and his.
Thank you. And last we have Luis Olmedo.
Luis Olmedo with Comité Cívico del Valle.
Perfect, thank you. And just as a reminder, please be sure to have your cameras on for all EJAC members. If you did provide a reason, then no need, but if you have not provided a reason, then please be sure to have it on for the duration of the whole meeting. And with that, we will move to a break. We're going to be having a break for about 15 minutes. So we will be back at 1:50 p.m. and our Zoom will remain open. So please be sure to get back right on that time. Thank you. Hi, so we are at quorum. So we're going to go ahead and get started again. I'm going to go ahead and pass it to our co-chairs to introduce this next item.
Good afternoon and welcome back, everybody. This is Dr. Catherine. Just again wanted to quickly express appreciation to all of the members of the CCUS DAC work group for helping put together today's agenda item, and really acknowledge and appreciate the work of Central Valley Air Quality Coalition and allies across the state and pushing really hard on CCUS and DAC as things similar to cap and trade that we absolutely do not want in our communities. And at the same time, we know for better or worse, often these projects are coming without our consent. So we've fought very hard to not just have a seat at the table, but to try to win some real community protections. So looking forward to the conversation today about this, and I'm going to pass it to Martha Dina to help remind us of some of the history of where we're coming from.
Thank you, Catherine. So I just want to remind folks about the history of our engagement around the issues of carbon capture and sequestration. So in 2021, EJ Group submitted a letter to CARB rejecting carbon capture and sequestration and providing some very detailed recommendations about the kinds of pre-work and community protections that we wanted, and we can resubmit that letter so that it's on the record as part of this rulemaking. In 2022, EJAC submitted our final recommendations and calls on CARB to exclude unproven dangerous technologies that build upon the current fossil fuel infrastructure, particularly in EJ communities. In 2023, the SB 905 is passed, and the process is now beginning. EJ groups, as Catherine said, try to stem the real threat posed by CCUS and related technologies, and EJ groups develop a platform on CCUS. And then in 2024, CARB begins the regulatory process for SB 905. And again, we see that much of the recommendations that the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee has presented are being ignored. And we're really concerned about what this means to our communities. And I try to do a fancy PowerPoint with Canva, and now I don't know how to navigate through it. So, these technologies pose a danger. We're going to hear from communities and from researchers in a little bit, but I want to show this photo because it happened yesterday. So yesterday in a town called Sulphur, it's Louisiana. There was a shelter in place and an emergency because of a CO2 pipeline break. And we will also see other pipeline breaks. This is incredibly unsafe. With the CO2, the health impacts are immediate. Folks, it's asphyxiant. Folks can't breathe. It renders internal combustion engines inoperable. So from a first responder point of view, there is very little that first responders can do. And you'll hear later about what the impacts were at the Shatarsa event. And so I'm not going to do all of this and maybe later because I don't want to step on any of the presenters. But all of this is to say that we've been working really hard with CARB to make sure that they're listening to the environmental justice concerns about the technology. But the concerns are growing beyond environmental justice communities, and many in the scientific community also have real doubts that this is the way to go. It's going to crowd out the kinds of solutions that we want. With that, I'm going to hand it over to our speakers.
Actually, first we're going to have Juan with CRPE speak about community level impacts, both as an EJAC member and as someone living in Kern County, which is absolutely on the front lines of these proposals in the San Joaquin Valley. And then Juan will pass it over to their colleague, Dan.
Thank you, Martelina, and thank you, Dr. Catherine. I think the main concern that our community members have is, one, this feeling of impotence of, one, again, being like an experiment, right? For a technology that is not proven, a technology that more often we continue to see that it has a lot of flaws. Thank you, Martelina, for sharing the picture. That's what our community members are afraid of. That's what our community members are saying. You're putting us again as a scapegoats just to see if it works, if it's something that can help us. So I think that our community members deserve a lot of respect and deserve our attention to these concerns that they have. Often they have said, you know what, we feel like second-class citizens where our needs and our input is not valued. So together with that, they're also afraid that using these technologies are going to present a lifeline to an industry that is dying naturally, to an industry that they have fought so hard against, which is the oil industry. They don't want to see this technology being used to re-enhance and recover more oil. They want to be clean. They want to be clear. I do want to stress again that our community's concerns are often silenced by the industry, are often silenced even by those agencies that are supposed to protect them. And the question that our community members would like to pose to CARB and to any other agency in the state of California pushing for CCS is, would you be responsible in 10, 20 years when there's a cancer cluster? Can they come back to you and say, you're the one responsible because you allowed this, because you did not put any protections in our communities, because often when sickness happens in our community, everybody starts pointing fingers, but nobody likes to take responsibility. And I think with this specific technology, we're at that moment where we can actually say, all right, we're gonna go ahead and this agency is responsible in the future. So with that, I'll leave it at that, and then I'll pass it to my colleague, Dan Reyes, who's here to do a presentation for us.
Dan, you're on mute.
Thanks. Did I press that button? Yeah, thank you for having me. Dan Rest, Senior Attorney for the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment. Thanks, Juan, for getting us introduced. And as Juan mentioned, our main concern is the community impacts here. And just to kind of underline, the technology itself has some serious local impacts, as well as sort of supporting other technologies that have really horrible impacts, including, like the BECCS project, the bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, having really serious local air and water pollutions, the pipeline disasters, which we heard a little bit about from RTD, and we'll hear about more, leaks from storage formations. You'll hear industry say a lot of the times that it all turns to stone in a few years. It's actually not true. It lasts for hundreds, maybe thousands of years in most formations, including the valley's sandstone. And so there are risks from those leaks, harming the groundwater and surface water. So I'm going to focus my presentation, however, on the climate impacts and then needed protections for communities. To jump into the climate risks of direct air capture and CCUS. The one thing is that most captured carbon, both nationally and globally, is used for enhanced oil recovery. That's not legal in California. That's a community protection we have in place. But California's incentive programs, including the low carbon fuel standard, incentivize using captured carbon for enhanced oil recovery, which releases 4 times as much carbon as it captures. So to call that a climate program is pretty disingenuous at best. And the federal 45Q is the main federal incentive program, and it also is very supportive of enhanced oil recovery, which is absurd. Then this is really, really expensive, and every public dollar that we put into and every private dollar that we sort of drive into this technology, that's funds that can't be used on things that actually help instead of harming our communities. And it's not really likely to get much cheaper. You'll hear that there's economies of scale, but there's not any sign of that. We've actually had CCS for decades and the price hasn't come down at all. So I don't think there's much sign that it's going to get significantly cheaper. Next slide, please. So generally for direct air capture, one of the big risks, we like to call it the moral hazard. Others say mitigation deterrence. The idea there is, well, we don't have to be as ambitious on direct emissions reductions. We'll just suck it all out of the sky and it'll be fine. The problem is that it is way more expensive and way less efficient to be doing things that way. And you continue to release all the other pollution from combustion, for example. So it's a really bad idea to be over-reliant on any sort of carbon dioxide removal. And then also, unless you're doing direct air capture with solar and wind and potentially some sort of energy storage, it's most likely releasing more carbon than it's pulling out because of how much energy that it requires, how much is released from combustion. And then even if you do it that best way, using solar and wind storage, or there's maybe a few other, geothermal perhaps, even doing that, you're denying those energy resources to the grid. And so there's still, you're essentially keeping in place fossil fuel resources instead of putting those same renewables onto the grid. So there's still a climate harm there. Next slide, please. So carbon capture, I think, has even graver climate risks. And again, our main concern is the local risks, but just to get in, even what this is supposed to be for climate, it doesn't do a good job. It's actually a distraction from proven solutions. And it's a delay because we're not going to be able to see how this doesn't work for too long if we land on this as a strategy moving forward, which there's a lot of energy to do. There's lock-in effects, both from public subsidies that we don't want to see stranded, and I think even more from private investment that has to be amortized, like you has to pay it off in your books, and that means that we're kind of stuck with it for a while. And you'll hear people say that the IPCC says we need CCUS. It doesn't at any point. The IPCC has never said that. They have modeled using CCS, but not exclusively, and they certainly haven't suggested that it's necessary. Next slide, please. So specifically, I'm going to talk about 3 specific types of CCS and the climate risks. And then there's a bunch of different applications, but I'll focus in on 3 for now. And if folks have questions, we can talk about some of the others. So refineries are huge, facilities. They have, a big California refinery has hundreds of emission streams, and each stream needs its own carbon capture apparatus. And they're big, expensive pieces of equipment. So you'd need hundreds of them. That's really, really impractical, especially since most of them don't have very pure carbon streams. So there's really only 1 or 2 at a typical refinery that would make sense to even attach carbon capture equipment. And there you're talking about, and typically, this isn't one of them, but typically we're looking at crowded urban refineries that don't have a lot of room for this sort of thing. So there's I think a serious question about how much could be done, even if you had unlimited funds for this. And in fact, CARB has modeled 70% carbon emissions reductions statewide by adding CCS to current refineries. That's impossible. It can't happen at our refineries. And as a result of that, this is sort of like that moral hazard. This delay where we're not going to be as ambitious as we need to in phasing out refineries because we're counting on a magic solution that can't work, that we know can't work, that CARB surely knows can't work. So that's a serious concern. We would encourage a different solution. Next slide, please. And so then talking about methane power plants. So this is an interesting one. You'll hear things about grid reliability and how we need natural gas power plants. Maybe, I don't know. I'm very skeptical that you can expect to stop climate change without stopping burning fossil fuels everywhere you can. The energy sector is one of the easiest places to stop burning fossil fuels. We absolutely can do it without it. And if you look at what CCS actually does in the real world, the actual emissions reductions, 30 to 40% emissions reductions. When you factor in the fact that there's an energy burden because it takes so much energy to run carbon capture of 25 to 30%, your net reduction per unit of energy is about 10%. So we're talking about locking in 90% of our emissions everywhere we spend billions of dollars to add carbon capture to these resources. And those are resources that then we can't take offline for a long time while we amortize those investments. So they're locked in and locking in 90% of those emissions. That doesn't seem like a good climate program to me. Next slide, please. BECCS, I just to reiterate, the local harms of BECCS are so immense. These were the worst point sources of criteria air pollution in the nation's worst air basin when they were running. And now they want to reopen those old facilities that shut down because they were so expensive and inefficient and open new ones because of the new subsidies. It doesn't make sense. And in terms of the climate math, it's a shell game with unrealistic assumptions. You have to pretend that these facilities are operating a way that they aren't operating in order for it to look like it's doing anything useful for climate. In fact, it's actually a net emitter, net positive. A lot of folks will try and say it's net negative. That's not true in the real world, only true on paper. And so those phony reductions hide the real emissions and I think causes some serious problems. So those are the 3 I wanted to focus in on in terms of the climate risks. And then I'll dive into the next slide, please. Some of the protections. And before we do get into the specific protections, I want to name that there's a mechanism for this right now in process. CARB has started an SB 905 rulemaking And we need the rules from that to provide very strong community protections. These projects are coming in now, and they're coming in fast. There are dozens coming into the valley and across the state. This map is not all of the projects. This is ones where we have specific locations and are far enough along that we can kind of talk about exactly what's happening at them. But a lot of there's at least twice as many projects that are being planned, and probably more that I haven't heard of. So they're happening now, and we need rules now, and we need strong ones to protect us. Next slide, please, and to protect the climate for that matter. So under SB 905, we won this language to provide strong protections, and CARB is required to ensure that all carbon capture projects include strategies to minimize to the maximum extent technologically feasible all co-pollutant emissions, both from operation and then from construction and transportation. That's a really strong statement, and then the state board is required to adopt regulations to enact that language. And there's a bunch of other community protections listed there. I just pulled out the first two. So we really need CARB to do that. And so far, we haven't had a commitment that CARB even plans to do rulemaking under the section, which they are required to do very, very clearly. So we really hope that CARB will step up and rise to the absolute need to have these strong community protections through this rulemaking and quickly. So diving into what those protections are on the next slide. So I have a few slides of this. We want to make sure that local air and water pollution is not increased, as kind of the last slide got to. We also want to make sure there's setbacks, that this isn't happening right next to homes. We built polluting infrastructure right next to where low-income people of color live for a century. And now we need to change that dynamic by not doubling down on that infrastructure. And making sure where we do deploy it, that it's far away from where our communities are. We need it to be powered by excess clean, renewable energy. That does not mean burning biomass, just to be clear. That is technically renewable, but it's certainly not clean. The three pillars also play a role there. If y'all are familiar with the hydrogen debate, that I think they're related in carbon capture and direct air capture, especially. Financial assurances need to be strong. If you're self-insuring, that's not a financial assurance. That's a hope. So we need third-party insurance or bonds that are upfront. And the quantities need to be continuously reevaluated, looking at the cost of closure, remediation, and leaks or other harms as we learn more about this technology that's never been done at scale before. Next slide, please. In terms of government process, we need to make sure that this fits into a program that actually works for climate. That means we can't use it to drag our heels on direct emissions reductions. The low carbon fuel standard basically is providing funding for direct air capture nationwide, such that every direct air capture credit that's generated means more fossil fuels are being burned. That's not a climate program. It needs to be actually negative for it to make sense. And so the offset crediting programs are really, really troubling for something like this. They also need to be additional. You can't count the same things twice. A lot of these things are double and triple credited, so they end up being counted in multiple programs. And that's also quite troubling. And we need to be really thoughtful about where the money comes, that this is coming from industries that are releasing the emissions and not from consumers through increased utility rates, say for natural gas power plants, or for increased gas prices through the low carbon fuel standard. Next slide, please. Then we really need strong CEQA here. CEQA is under threat, and that's a problem generally, but especially here for these speculative new technologies. When people say not a new technology, okay, new at scale, never studied with the thought to how does this actually impact climate or local public health. And so we want to see strong protections even beyond CEQA, notifying community members at least 6 months before a permit application, have at least 3 public workshops before any government decisions are made, requiring community benefits, which DOE, to their credit, has done some work on, but that's only for a few projects. We need to see a full environmental impact report on all projects, no sort of streamlining of any sort. And we really want to see worst case scenario modeling. What happens if this goes wrong before a project goes ahead? Next slide, please. So storage, other issues, I think they're a little less relevant to the CARB rulemaking, but CARB actually does have some specific statutory jurisdiction over this and under SB 905. And we want to see a lot of these things happen, and CARB needs to be a partner in that. So we need really good studies of the storage, the pore space where this will be stored, knowing not just how much could we possibly store, but what's the safe storage rate? How do we minimize leakage from storage? How do we minimize impacts on earthquakes and seismicity? What kind of distance from homes and sensitive receptors is safe? You know, we've said 10 miles. That might be wrong. Maybe it's 15. Maybe it's 5. We need to know the best distance, especially for this underground storage. How do we know what's safe? And we need good research to show that. We need to know the impacts on microbiota and the rock formations. That's a wonky one, which we can dive into if folks have questions. I know Martedina knows a lot about that as well. We need to show that that California is kind of known for its earthquakes. So how does that impact the storage formation? Does that mean we're going to have more leaks? And does that mean that by injecting large amounts of a gas to pressurize a storage formation that will cause earthquakes, as we've seen with fracking in other states? How do we know this is permanent? We need at least 1,000 years, knowing that it does stay as a gas underground for a long time. How do we make sure that we're characterizing the sites well? That means, like, how do we make sure we know where the gas is going underground? Carbon dioxide will do what it does underground, and we want to not say, oh, well, it's going to go to the, it's going to go to the northeast. How do you know that? Well, because there's a community in the southwest, and we're pretty sure it won't go under them. That's what happened in Mendota, and the permit application to US EPA had to be withdrawn because of that. So we need to be really thoughtful about that. Really strong monitoring, reporting, and verification regimes, and pausing injections if the plume isn't behaving as expected, which will help with proper site characterization. And then really certifying that this whatever project it is unlikely to harm groundwater supplies. I have one last slide on transportation, which I'll go through pretty quick because I know Amanda's going to talk more about this. But really want to emphasize the carbon pipeline moratorium. I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about what happens if we lose on the carbon pipeline moratorium and there are new pipelines and aren't strong regulations or isn't strong enforcement, and we have a huge disaster, and suddenly there's 500 fewer people in Arvin. It's possible, and we need to make sure that doesn't happen. We need strong regs before we lift the moratorium. A few of these other things, adding an odor and a colorant so you know when something happens. Really thinking about community burdens and resources during siting. That includes like where hospitals, making sure the geology doesn't impact, like earthquakes aren't going to destroy the pipeline, cause problems, making sure we have a good regulatory definition that hits all the carbon dioxide that will be transported. Don't convert old pipelines to carbon dioxide. Require pure carbon streams so that there's not as much corrosion in the which will happen in the presence of water and some other chemicals. Don't just transport by truck or something because there's a moratorium in place when actually the pipeline might be the best way. So I'll stop there and pass it on to the next panelist.
Thank you, Dan, Juan, and Martedina. This is Dr. Catherine. I just quickly wanted to remind folks we have one more panelist, and then Martedina will close us out. Then we'll go to EJAC discussion, comments, and questions. So folks, get ready for that. And then just a friendly reminder to people in the public, after EJAC discussion, we will go to public comment. So if you're in the public and you want to comment on this item or any of the previously discussed items, please feel free to raise your hand and get yourself in the queue. So next, we're going to hear from Amanda McKay with Pipeline Safety Trust.
Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda McKay. I'm the policy manager with the Pipeline Safety Trust. If you can go to the next slide, please. The Pipeline Safety Trust is the only national watchdog organization for the pipeline industry. We were formed in the aftermath of a pipeline tragedy in Bellingham, Washington, which is where I'm based, where the organization is based. where over 250,000 gallons of gasoline spilled into a local creek, and it eventually ignited and killed 3 boys in our community. And it was absolutely because of negligence on the operator and negligence from the regulator as well. And so the community, under multiple circumstances, were able to pull together and speak up and advocate for a watchdog organization. And that's how the Pipeline Safety Trust was formed. And that is our bedrock and why we continue to do our work today. Unfortunately, pipeline tragedies do continue to happen, but there have been some really strong regulatory advancements due to Bellingham and other tragedies. And so that's kind of where we're coming from and our focus as an organization. Next slide, please. So a little bit of quick history on CO2 pipelines. I won't go through all of this, but PHMSA, the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, underneath the Department of Transportation, is the federal regulator on CO2 pipelines. And they issued a rule on CO2 pipelines in 1988, but it essentially added "and CO2" to the federal liquid pipeline regulations. And so there really is nothing specific in the federal regulations to carbon dioxide transport by pipeline. And that's kind of how it's been since 1988. Obviously, in 2020, there was a disaster in Satartia, Mississippi, which is the photo in this slide, where a Denbury pipeline ruptured and it caused 45 people to go to the hospital. People were found unconscious, unable to breathe, and had to be carried from the scene. This really woke a lot of us up, including the Pipeline Safety Trust, to the dangers of transporting carbon dioxide by pipeline. And a big credit to Dan Ziegart, who wrote the article "Gassing of Satartia." If you haven't read it, it's very powerful. And it really kind of started this big discussion. Of course, since then, we've had tax credit expansions, incentives for companies to start doing CCS and CCUS projects. As others mentioned, the main use for CO2 in pipelines has been enhanced oil recovery, but now we're seeing this push to expand CO2 pipeline mileage for other uses as well. In 2023, PHMSA did hold a public meeting on CO2 pipelines, and they actually held it in Des Moines, Iowa, which is very rare for a federal agency, especially PHMSA, to hold a public meeting in an area where a lot of new projects are being proposed. And I think we learned a lot from that public meeting, and I think PHMSA learned a lot from that public meeting. And so there actually is a notice of proposed rulemaking that is expected to be announced this year. And we really don't know what's going to be in that. Of course, there's a couple things on here that I didn't add. SB 905 was huge in 2022. Louisiana adopted their own carbon dioxide pipeline rules in 2023 that provide some additional safeguards for that state. And so there's really just been a lot happening in this space. But I think the biggest thing to kind of keep an eye out for is that PHMSA notice of proposed rulemaking. And it'll be really telling once we see what's in that. The chart on the bottom just really emphasizes how little experience pipeline operators have with CO2 pipelines. Right now, there's roughly 5,000 miles of carbon dioxide pipelines in the US, and then the two lines below it are the expected mileage, and then that as compared to existing hazardous liquid transmission pipelines in the US. Next slide, please. This is just kind of going over a little bit of what I just talked about. This has really become a top priority for the Pipeline Safety Trust. I'll go into some of the federal regulatory gaps later on. But as I said, really, there's no specific CO2 regulations in the federal regulations right now. And with this sort of estimated build out of CO2 pipelines, it's really concerning. Next slide, please. So after Satartia and after PST kind of identified this as a main priority of ours, we did commission a pipeline safety report by an independent pipeline safety engineer on the dangers of CO2 pipelines. And some of the things that report identified, as Dan mentioned towards the end of his presentation, their presentation, is that CO2 can move in different states. And it is really dependent on the temperature and the pressure as it moves through the pipeline. So this top left chart shows that CO2 has to be moved at a really high pressure and a pretty high temperature to remain in a supercritical fluid state, which is sort of this in between a gas and a liquid. And why that's important is because the federal definition of CO2 in the federal regulations is that CO2 is in a supercritical fluid state, which means that there are no regulations for liquid or gas CO2 movement by pipeline. And what we've kind of found from this, looking into this, is that the CO2 may enter and exit the pipeline in a supercritical fluid state, but it's pretty likely that it is changing states within that pipeline. It's probably moving into a liquid phase at one point or another. And so that creates some concerns around if there is a rupture, whether or not there would be the ability for protections on the behalf of the community. So that's a major finding. We also looked at just the obvious fact that CO2 is heavier than air. It's an asphyxiant. When a pipeline ruptures, it is releasing a massive amount of CO2 into the air because it is in this kind of highly pressurized state. And so what we learned from that is that plume dispersion modeling is incredibly important, because we saw from Satartia that the community was not aware that there was a pipeline within an area that might be of danger to them, and the community response was not equipped to deal with a pipeline rupture of that magnitude. And so that's something incredibly important to consider. Also, the fact that CO2 can have unique properties that create fracture propagation along pipelines, meaning that when a rupture happens, it can basically open up a pipeline like a zipper, creating a much larger release in a quicker amount of time. So less time for communities to respond in the event of a rupture. And then this top right chart just really talks about the importance of the potential for water within a CO2 pipeline. Water, when it combines with CO2, forms carbonic acid and can create issues of severe corrosion along a pipeline. And so if we aren't monitoring what is going into that pipeline, and we're not monitoring water levels, contaminant levels, continuously, then we can have some major issues along pipelines. Next slide, please. So then when talking about CO2 pipelines and environmental justice communities, it has the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Committee has stated that CCS and direct air capture are not projects that benefit a community. We've also, of course, seen that oil and gas projects, in addition to the future build out of potential CCUS projects, are providing this disproportionate burden on environmental justice communities. And we see that directly with routing and siting issues. There's been multiple instances of pipelines being routed through environmental justice communities because that was quote unquote the path of least resistance. And so we want to be incredibly cognizant of that and see that potential in the potential build out of CCUS. Next slide, please. So a little bit of what I've already said, but there was an accident investigation report after the Satarsha incident. There was also a fine on Denbury. In progress is a new rulemaking for CO2 pipelines, and there's also been funding provided for research and development projects related to contaminant levels within pipelines, related to plume dispersion modeling, related to proper odorants that could be added into CO2 pipelines. As Dan mentioned, there isn't an odorant right now that's been identified to not negatively interact with CO2 within a pipeline. And so those are all gaps that need to be filled before there's this potential massive build out. Some challenges is that right now at the federal level, there's no congressional mandate to go through with this rulemaking. Luckily, PHMSA is going through with a rulemaking, but we know that federal rulemaking takes years. And so, they announced it last year. They're going to hopefully publish the notice of proposed rulemaking this year. But after that, I mean, it's going to take a really long time to get these regulations in place, and we don't even know how stringent and how detailed they're going to be. And then also there's statutory limitations. There's the Section 60104B legacy clause, which basically says that any pipelines that have already been started in the construction process don't have to apply new construction rules to them. So if the federal CO2 rulemaking includes specific guidelines for construction, that those won't apply to pipelines that have already started to be built. And so that is why the SB 905 pipeline moratorium is really important, because there may be some really important safety measures that are coming out of this PHMSA rule that we wouldn't want projects to have started because those rules may not apply. Next slide, please. So just thinking about next steps, I didn't talk too much about siting and routing, but this is a really big issue considering that CO2 pipelines are considered liquid pipelines, hazardous liquid pipelines. There is no federal agency that oversees routing and siting. So it is up to state and local agencies to be tasked with that process. And so it's a big burden on local agencies. And so that's something that is kind of this gap that we see. Obviously, the R&D projects are ongoing and those take time as well. And so really waiting to see kind of what the outcomes are of those, closing the regulatory gaps through federal and state level regulations. And I put and state level regulations in there because we know that interstate pipelines must abide by the federal pipeline regulations, and intrastate pipelines must also abide by federal pipeline regulations, but states have the opportunity to offer additional protections for intrastate pipelines. And I think that's a really great opportunity for California to take it further than the federal regulations and provide additional protections to their communities. And then, of course, local efforts to ensuring safety. We talk about emergency response, plume dispersion modeling, making sure that communities are aware of the potential dangers if a CO2 pipeline is coming through their community. So just a lot of education, collaboration, awareness, and preparedness is really important. Next slide, please. All right, I think that is it. But yes, available for any questions, and thank you so much for allowing me the time today.
Thank you so much. And I see that we've got some questions from EJAC members, and I do want to share one final slide. One of our physician members put this together, and I think it's important, as with the previous speaker, talking about disbursement and how fast this goes. Just want to remind people what the health impacts are, right? At 20,000 ppms, respiratory centers are stimulated, causing increase in breathing. At 40,000, increase in breathing rate becomes distressing, development of respiratory acidosis. Then we go on to dim sight, sweating, tremor, increased heart rate, and blood pressure can cause convulsions and coma and loss of consciousness and death. And it's pretty rapid because it's an asphyxiant. And so these are concerns to both communities and to workers who are near these pipelines. And so I just want to, and I want to make a comment on the odorants. You know, my background is in toxics. And so what will be in these chemical odorants that will be added, and how will those impact? So there's so many reasons to put up a red light on this technology. So much we don't know, enough that we do know that it seems to pose some unnecessary risks to our communities. And so we, again, just want to reiterate that without worst case scenario planning, without really, you know, looking at the life cycle impacts, and sort of from the perspective of environmental justice communities, we exist because regulations and protections have failed. And so, you know, I am very skeptical that we can actually develop a regulatory regime that actually protects communities, especially if we're building this on top of existing oil infrastructure, where we already know that our communities are being sacrificed for these technologies. And so with that, I'm going to call on, I saw John's hand go up and then Matt go up for questions.
Yeah, that was very informative. My question is, like you said, they're going through the community, but the first responders, I mean, the community is completely unaware of this and what the cause and effect is. We have cause and effect earthquakes, floods, electrical outages, but this CO2 is very dangerous. And also, who's putting this stuff in? Where are they getting the workers from? Is it the trades, or are they just, where are they getting their training from to even install the conduit the correct way? Because I can see just dangers on top of dangers, and the reason why they go through the poor communities because they're looking at the value of life. Something goes on over there, it's really nothing. And most people are unaware because they at work or maybe working 2 or 3 jobs, but that stuff seems really dangerous. And I've never seen anything with a cleanup or what can happen if one of these things break or bust open. What are you supposed to do?
Thank you, Big John. I mean, we've spoken to some first responders, and there's not much they can do. Their trucks won't go in because they're internal combustion engines, and those stop when there's a CO2 leak. The reports out of Satartia that people were walking around zombie-like were really alarming. And then with that, I'm going to pass it to Matt and then Kevin Jefferson.
Yeah, I want to just double down on John's comment that we've got a trade sector that has trouble holding on to saline injection fluid and gaseous methane, and we expect them to hold on to this highly energetic supercritical fluid. And you know, the purity that Dan brought up and Amanda mentioned it as well. This is a lengthy refining process, and I don't see a workforce out there that's prepared to handle it, and I see it being pushed forward willy-nilly. We've got CARB protocols for CCS, for protocols that really have no monitoring features that are adequate. I've tried to work with my local government to develop an emergency response for heat events and for wildfire events, and the institutions don't exist. Nobody's working together, and they certainly aren't being included in and being asked to help design the rollout of this, new energy economy. I wanted to talk briefly because I heard Amanda acknowledge SB 905 and Dan was talking about it too. A bunch of people work their butts off to try to, I guess, convince the state that they shouldn't use money to bury CO2 to dig up more oil, and that we wanted serious community health protections. But I've been to the SB 905 workshop, and they're only about how to divide the royalties and how to push over the one property owner who doesn't want to go along with it. So it doesn't seem to be pursuing the spirit of the bill that we passed, and so it just doesn't bode well. It doesn't feel like our concerns are being heard about the health and safety risks. And I think CARB's not only not listening to communities, they're not listening to the Department of Energy. I mean, how many of us were there at the symposium in Stockton when we heard the director of DOE Energy say out loud with her hands in the air, CCUS makes no sense on refineries. But here we still have it in California policy. So there's a lot of energy to try to ram this thing through, and it's going to hurt a lot of different people. Thanks, Dan and Amanda, for flagging this. I worry that we're going to hurt workers. We're gonna injure communities. I mean, I've seen some of the modeling. Conveniently, all the CO2 ruptures just shoot straight up into the air and never happen to impact any of the infrastructure to the side or beneath them. Feels really disingenuous. I got to be honest. This is one of the things that really rattles my confidence in the regulatory sector.
Thanks, Matt. And I think what our presenter Dan wants to respond to one of the comments, and I'll let him do that, and then I'll go back to the queue. So
Thanks, Marty. Sorry for skipping the queue briefly. Just wanted to respond directly to Matt's comment about the fact that so far the SB 905 rulemaking has been focused on some strange things that don't seem to be our main interests. And I will say, in the state's defense, the agency that's been doing that is California Natural Resources Agency, and they have a tiny part of the rulemaking that is really wonky and technical and is on what Matt was talking about. And I actually really, really appreciate the way that CNRA has been outreaching and engaging the public and impacted community members to really try and thoughtfully navigate those issues, which are challenging. I'm curious to see what they come up with, but I appreciate the process. The flip side is that for some reason, CNRA, which has like a small marginal bit of this, is doing really great, and CARB is doing nothing publicly, maybe behind the scenes that we don't know about and they're not telling us about. But why the thing that really matters, that we fought really hard to get these strong community protections for, so far we haven't seen much of, and we really do need that. So echoing Matt's call for a better process and regulations in the community protection space.
Thanks, Dan. So next is Tom and then Kevin Jefferson. Did I get that order wrong? Sorry.
I think Kevin had his hand up first.
Go for it, Kevin, and you might be muted.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to say, as a co-chair of the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, one of the things that I've discovered is that the air districts are not first responders. They've somehow written in their policy or their it's written in the code that they are not our first responder. And what that basically entails is that although we have first responders and fire departments and things of that nature, they do not have access to the facilities until the air district shows up. If the air district is not a first responder, they do not have to show up in due time. Because the air districts are shortly staffed and primarily work 9 to 5 hours, they're not there on the scenes. And that is seen in the huge Martinez issue that took place Thanksgiving of last year. And in fact, there's been several more incidences there, but with the agency that is tasked with enforcing and monitoring, real-time monitoring, if they're not a first responder, by law or code or whatever you call it, this whole equation is messed up. We talk about health discrepancies. We talk, Ms. Martha gave examples of what just took place in another state. It's clear, you could see what's going on. But if the district is not out there monitoring in real time, in 3 days, that same negative scene air monitoring wise is not going to be there. And then they just deem it, oh, it's okay now. So I think we need to work on changing the real roles and responsibilities of the air districts so that they are first responders and that we could get to these scenes in due time and get the real information and therefore enforce in real time.
Thanks. All right, Tom.
Hello. I've brought up these points before, maybe even several times in these meetings, but I'm going to run through them all again because I'm not sure what else to do at this point. It seems like these projects keep moving forward, but I've brought it up. I put it as a link in the chat this time so the folks can take a look. There might be a paywall, unfortunately, is our current state of journalism, but it's an article that was in the Modesto Bee. It was written by Vance Kennedy, who worked for 40 years with the U.S. Geological Survey. He's a awarded geologist. He unfortunately passed away recently. But this article was in reaction to the news that the company Ametis, which is the same company I've mentioned before, using LCSF credits to increase local air pollution and traffic in the riverbank where I live. It's this little red spot. Oh wait, I'm like backwards. Up here, the very northern red spot on this disadvantaged communities map, which is why I keep mentioning, that there's nothing protecting disadvantaged communities from having pollution actually increased by this California and federal money that's going towards these companies. So this very same company, it has an exploratory well permit. They want to do carbon capture in Riverbank. We mentioned, the 10-mile radius. This is within a mile of the elementary school that my children go to, and the local high school are both about a mile away. There's houses within a quarter mile, half a mile from this facility. And in this article from Vance Kennedy, the geologist, he explains how there is ancient salt water below the earth that will be displaced by this carbon when it is pumped underground. It will go in all directions wherever it can, and eventually it will end up in our fresh water, which would ruin the drinking water for many community members, not to mention the water that is used by many of the farmers to grow crops. So he strongly advises against this strategy of putting carbon below the ground. And when the CEO of Ametis actually attended one of our EJAC meetings, and I got a chance to talk to him a little bit, and I asked if they were concerned about a carbon pipeline running through the community there, and he said, "Oh, don't worry about that. We'll be trucking the carbon in," which to me seems insane. Think of diesel truck by diesel truck bringing in that amount of carbon that they want to put underground. Again, this is the same company bringing animal fats, animal tallow, and plant oils from as far as India and other places, also trucking those in through this disadvantaged community of Riverbank, adding almost 100 diesel trucks to the road. Just to do their biofuels and sustainable aviation fuels project. So I can't even imagine the amount of trucks that will then be added to those roads if they are trucking in carbon to pump underground. So I just wanted to share that article this time. Like I said, I know I've mentioned it and bring up, as Matt mentioned earlier, the way that this is playing out on the ground in these communities. This particularly my community, not just where I work, which is, the kind of the whole Stanislaus County, northern San Joaquin Valley, but literally where I live, where my family lives, in Riverbank. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Do we have any other questions or comments from EJAC members? Okay, so we will be reviewing today's meeting notes, our other comments, and probably submitting. Oh, Kevin, go for it.
So sorry, the storm crashed our internet here. I mean, it was pretty crazy for a few minutes with hail and everything. So I'm on my phone again. So I just wanted to, first of all, echo my colleagues' concerns and appreciate the panel's amazing presentation. And I think it's important to recognize we talk about CO2 like it's it's this gas, it's in the air, it's around us, we breathe. Yeah, if you get too much in the room, you can suffocate. Everybody's seen the TV show where somebody uses that to murder somebody or whatever. But the thing about CO2 is you have to put it into a liquid form in order to transport it. That means you have to put it under pressure, and a lot of pressure, like 1,000 PSI pressure. Now, natural gas already runs through these pipelines at those kinds of pressures, terrifying in and of itself. So we're going to run that through the San Joaquin Valley, through California, probably some of the most unstable geology in the United States, where how many plates meet, if you are a fan of that particular belief in geology that is real, whether you believe it or not. And in this valley, which is notorious for little shakers every now and then, and the pipeline is well known to be leaky as is. It's under constant observation, repairs, and still doesn't get everything. We have a history where we saw parts of an entire community blown up in one place. We've had another couple of communities here in the valley where leaks from one of these pipelines has caused the evacuation of an entire neighborhood. So now we're going to put this new gas in there that, by the way, when it comes out explosively because it wants to return to its natural state, which is not liquid. So natural gas can have a natural state where it's gaseous. It comes out that way when it comes out of a well, but CO2 doesn't. So we've had to artificially create it in its form as a gas. And now we're going to highly pressurize it, stick it in this pipeline, and put it under the ground. I don't know about you, but it scares the crap out of me. So, and we're going to run it in places either parallel to or use existing pipelines that are falling out of use because we're moving away from CNG that already had problems. So, I mean, when you think about it that way, and not so esoterically, it's just CO2 that's in the air everywhere, and, it's just something we all breathe. I think we need to take a step back and really consider what we're doing here. And then the second point is, continues to be ludicrous to think that we could create enough of these facilities to make a dent in our atmospheric CO2. This reminds me of the guy who wanted to put big fans across the Sierra to blow pollution, suck pollution out of the valley and blow it over into the Owens Valley on the other side. I mean, it all sounds cool in sci-fi, but of course, it's ridiculous on its face, and it will fail in operation. And I think it's important to restate that all of these facilities that have been put up, for the most part, have been shut down. None have been able to run successfully in a way that could actually pencil out. So is the state, who's already underwriting things like LCFS and other programs, are we going to underwrite that one too? Because we're going to make money out the other end. I think Dan's presentation really did a great job of showing the energy debt more than erases the reduction in carbon as being an efficient way to do this. So I just want to thank everybody for a fantastic presentation and just make those points. Thank you. Back
Thanks,
to you, Chip.
Kevin. So if we have no other comments or questions, Matt?
Super quick. Kevin just reminded me, hey, don't worry, the guy making money off it's the only one monitoring it. No third-party monitoring, no trust but verified injection sites. A non-existent monitoring protocol is what's going to warn local communities. I mean, it's just outrageous.
Yeah, I mean, this has been the consistent message from the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, from the global environmental justice movement, that this is not, that this is a climate dead end and that we should not be investing public dollars. And with that, I'm going to follow my own advice and stop talking and open it up for public comment. And we're commenting on both the topics that we've heard. And at some point we will close the, so if you want to get into public comment, please raise your hand. And at some point we will be closing the queue.
Thank you, Martha Dina. So yeah, we will now be opening up the public comment period. We ask that everybody who is interested in speaking in Zoom raise their hands and we will call on you accordingly. Please be sure to be stating your name and affiliation before you provide your question or comment. Thank you. So it looks like we have no in-person comments, so we're just going to move straight to our Zoom comments. The first comment that we have is coming from Dallas Gerber. Dallas, your line has been unmuted and you're now free to speak. Dallas, please be sure to unmute yourself as well.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, my name is Dallas Gerber, Director of State Government Affairs with Growth Energy. We are the nation's largest association of biofuels producers. We represent 97 biofuel producers who collectively produce more than 9 billion gallons of cleaner burning renewable fuel annually and more than 100 businesses associated with the production process. Mr. Cullenward's presentation on the financial impacts of cap and trade and the LCFS highlight the need to consider compliance costs for California residents. While the opportunities to change distribution of costs impacts in cap and trade were demonstrated, CARB can reduce the LCFS's impact on Californians by approving fuels with higher blends of bioethanol for the state's passenger vehicle fleet. Data shows a 46% reduction in GHGs with ethanol compared to gasoline. And while most gasoline sold in California contains 10% bioethanol, commonly called E10, E15 has been approved by the US EPA for passenger vehicles model 2001 and model year 2001 and newer. And it can be deployed immediately to reduce GHGs. Also, research conducted by UC Riverside and the University of Illinois has shown E15 to reduce harmful particulates and air toxics. These pollution reductions would benefit environmental justice communities that are disproportionately impacted by air pollution. There are also economic benefits for consumers in using E15. Last summer, E15 saw an average of 15 cents per gallon in savings nationwide compared to E10. And in some states, there were instances of 40 to 60 cent per gallon savings. E15 can be a vital contributor to achieving GHG reductions. A simple switch from E10 to E15 statewide would reduce GHG emissions by 1.8 million tons. This is the emissions reduction equivalent of taking 400,000 cars off California roads each year while providing a more affordable fuel for drivers. Additionally, E85, which is already approved in California, is a fuel containing between 51 and 83% ethanol and can be used in the more than 1.3 million flex fuel vehicles already registered in California. Incentivizing the use of E15 and E85 will achieve multiple goals: improving air quality and reducing GHG emissions, reducing the state's dependence on fossil fuels, and providing consumers with an affordable choice to power their vehicles. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Evan Edgar. Evan, your line has been unmuted and you're now free to speak.
Hello, Evan Edgar, engineer on behalf of the California Compost Coalition. It's been great working with your committee over the last couple years on the scoping plan, and we have supported the use of life cycle assessment for pesticides on natural working lands. So it's been a really good program working with organic compost to use on the healthy soils. And within the cap and trade money, one of the avenues that we had $11 million used for healthy soils to use organic compost out there. It's been a great program. The last round was oversubscribed by 10 times. So we're making more and more compost with SB 1383, diverting more organics out of the landfill, reducing methane. So and we have some good targets. So it's been a great program. So under cap and trade is one of the most cost-effective programs is compost use on natural working lands. And once you do the life cycle analysis on pesticides, it will make it so much stronger and better to have organic compost for regenerative agriculture. Another bill was passed was SB 27, was for carbon sequestration on natural working lands. It's a registry, and we support it. And there's a lot of good programs listed there now for, and we have some programs listed under the registry to sequester carbon for forest health, land conservation, urban greening, healthy soils, and those are great programs. So we believe in, to sequester carbon within a soil is a great thing. And this is, and it's great for wetlands, great. So for doing that, and so healthy soils carbon use is great. And sometimes we're confused with this geological stuff. I only got a minor in geology from Chico State, and I don't really believe in a lot of this technical underground geological storage either. And so, but we're bundled in the same registry. And sometimes there's confusion within a lot of groups of what I'm doing with carbon soil storage in a healthy soils, which is a great thing that we've got support from the environmental justice community on regenerative ag and carbon farming, which I'm doing more of. And somehow we're bundled with this other stuff I don't believe in, which is carbon capture and storage in a geological structure. So working with the SB 27 registry at the national working agencies, we're able to list them out separately. So I wanted transparency that when we do good carbon capture within the soils of California, we're listed as healthy soils. And when we do this other stuff, and there's no projects listed yet in the registry for underground geological storage, which is good. I don't believe in that, but I just want to make that statement today that we're supporting the work at what you're doing. And just when you talk about sequestering carbon within the national working lands, it's okay to do it on the healthy soils. And that's what I'm promoting today. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you. And next we have Rita Loof. Rita, your line has been unmuted and you're now free to speak.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Rita Loof, Director of Environmental Affairs for RADTEC International. And we are the Association for the Advancement of Ultraviolet Electron Beam Light Emitting Diode Technology, which is a low VOC, all electric pollution prevention technology. And I wanted to make some general comments regarding the legislative analyst recommendations to identify proposed policies and programs for achieving goals for greenhouse gas reductions. And I wanted this committee to be aware that some of the policies at the air district level act as barriers to the conversion to electric processes that do not emit greenhouse gases. UV EV LED technology is all electric. So when businesses convert to our processes, they're usually removing polluting processes and control devices like afterburners, which burn fuels and emit greenhouse gases. But the air districts do not give any benefit to companies that are voluntarily reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. The current policies do not recognize, let alone encourage, greenhouse gas reductions. And the command and control approach really acts as a barrier to new technologies. And it is punitive. So what ends up happening is that manufacturing moves out of California, but there's still a demand for goods. So the companies truck the goods into California or transport them by rail, thereby creating emissions from goods movement. So we hope that these issues can be addressed at some point, and thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. So those were all the raised hands that I saw. We just wanted to provide one last call for anyone wanting to provide a comment to raise their hand now, or we will just go ahead and move on to our last item. Okay, I see one comment from Dean Flores. Dean, your line has been unmuted and you're now free to speak.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for doing the work today. It sounded great. I have one question, Martha, maybe for the group for another time, but I was very intrigued at kind of the statutory limitations and what we don't know about the carbon capture technology. So I don't know if CARB can do this a little further, or you guys have seen this, but it feels like the legislature is looking at it, but yet not weighing in. So I'd just like to say that that comment really kind of piqued the interest and should pique CARB's interest as well in terms of just what impediments are there that we aren't aware of, even statutorily. So I just want to make that comment. I thought it was definitely something that, given that the amount of weight it has in our plan, really needs to be explored.
Thanks, Dean. Not sure. I want to think about my response to that. And I don't know if any other committee members want to respond, or maybe one of our speakers. But we will definitely, well, I mean, my sense is that due to the vast amounts of funding from federal dollars, that the legislature is very focused on the money and the promise of it, that it might work. And my sense is that the information about the drawbacks isn't making it to the legislature. And that's, probably on us and a little on CARB as well. And then Matt, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to say the uncertainty that you're describing, Dean, is exactly when we invoke the precautionary principle. We don't have to do this stuff. We don't have to take these risks. Somebody needs to make a better case.
All right, so if we don't have any more public comments, we can close out and go to the next agenda item.
Yeah, we can go ahead and move on to our last agenda item. So co-chairs, do you have any next steps and closing remarks that you would like to provide at this time?
Well, I think the next steps for the EJAC is, I recommend reviewing all the documents that got sent out, the PowerPoints, the EJAC recommendations, and the comment letters, and others, so that we can actually come up similarly to what we did with the low carbon fuel standard, develop some recommendations and a resolution that goes to the board, so that when we can continue this conversation with the board. And we've got some time. So this may be the topic for our joint EJAC and CARB board meeting later in the year. That's what I know I'm doing for next steps, and helping put together that resolution with the input of my EJAC co-chairs and other members who are interested. I don't know if there's any other comments.
Thank you, Martha Dina. So if there's no other comments, this concludes our meeting for today. Our next meeting is planned for May 16th in Sacramento. And thank you everyone so much for joining and participating, and have a great rest of your evening.
Yep. And really, thank you to the speakers and to the EJAC and all the public commenters. Thank you.